I've been camping with my best friend Tyler ever since we were 13 years old. I'm 31 now, and it's become a yearly tradition for us. Just a way to step out of our daily routines, get off our phones, leave the noise behind, and sleep under the stars like we used to when life was simpler. We've gone all over the place. State parks, backcountry trails, car camping, dispersed forest sites, even random clearings we found off logging roads. We've seen wild animals, walked into storms, and had to rig broken gear in the middle of the night, but nothing ever truly rattled us. Until last year in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We'd picked a week in mid-October. It was peak season, leaves at full color, chilly air that smelled of damp leaves and pine, the kind of quiet where you hear wind moving over ridgelines before it hits you. The original plan was to get there before noon on a Friday, claim a spot at one of the less trafficked pull-off sites, and chill. We were both late getting out of town, and the drive ended up taking longer because of leaf peepers and tourists who flooded the mountain roads this time of year. By the time we got to the area we had scouted on Google Maps, somewhere off a forest road halfway up a ridgeline, the sun was already cutting low. The light through the trees had that gold and purple tone that only lasts a few minutes. We pulled off at a small gravel clearing just big enough for a car and tent space. It looked fine, a little sloped, and we immediately noticed how strong the wind was up there, like constantly howling. Still, we figured we didn't have a choice, not with daylight almost gone. We'd brought firewood, a tent we could pitch in our sleep, and a decent meal we'd prepped the night before. So we did what we always did. Set up camp quickly, got a fire going, cracked some beers, and let the weight of work and city life fall off our shoulders. That first night wasn't the scary part. It was uncomfortable. The wind was nonstop and kept snapping the tent walls, even with extra guy lines. Our fire smoked more than burned, and we could barely hear each other talk sometimes. Neither of us slept well. The wind found its way into every zipper flap and snapped us awake every hour. When the sun came up, we were groggy and annoyed, and everything had that damp, gritty feeling like a wet sock that won't dry. So we decided to head down into town. A small place at the base of the mountain, couple stores, some local diners, and a bar we remembered from a trip years back. We ate greasy burgers, had a few beers, and mostly killed time until the afternoon. Around 3 or 4, we figured it was time to head back up the mountain and relocate our camp to a better spot. More out of the wind, ideally flatter. It's not like we had a reservation or anything, just the open woods, plenty of forest roads to explore. We drove slow, scanning the trees for places other people weren't. After about an hour of poking around different cutoffs, we found a spot maybe a mile off the main road. There was a single rutted trail that looped down through the trees, wide enough for the car but clearly not well traveled. It opened into a soft, level clearing nestled between 2 small hills. The ground was covered in pine needles and leaves, the soil dry and flat. No wind, no trash, no signs of recent use. It felt like the kind of place you stumble on and don't want to tell anyone about. We got to work quickly. The light was already slipping again, and the trees made it even darker. We pitched our tents, got the fire pit cleared and going, set up a little cooking station on a flat rock, and stacked our gear close. It was peaceful. The air was still and quiet. Even the birds seemed to quiet down once it got dark. By 7, it felt like midnight. We kept the fire going and just talked. We've been friends since grade school, so it was a mix of the same old jokes, random stories, and long pauses where we just stared at the flames and listened to the woods. By 11, we were a few beers in, warm from the fire and relaxed in that soft buzzed way you get when you're far from cell towers and headlights. There was no traffic noise, no wind, no animals moving. Just that deep silence you only get in the woods at night. It must have been close to 1 a.m. when I saw it. A light, not bright, just a soft, white glow bobbing between the trees maybe 30 yards away, up toward the trail we'd driven in on. I thought it was weird because there were no other campsites around. We hadn't passed any other cars, hadn't seen a soul for hours. We figured maybe it was a ranger doing rounds, or someone lost trying to find their spot. I didn't feel worried yet, just confused. Who hikes around at 1 a.m. with no trail, no obvious direction? We watched the light move closer. Tyler stood up, stretched, and kept his eyes on it too. We both kind of instinctively turned down our music and stopped talking. It wasn't moving fast, just steady. Then the beam lifted like a flashlight scanning forward and caught the edge of our tent. Then the fire. That's when it came straight toward us. We stayed standing side by side, just watching. As the figure got closer, we could make out a man, mid-50s maybe, gray stubble, wearing a thin t-shirt and loose basketball shorts. No jacket, no pack, nothing. Following behind him was a woman, mid-40s probably. She was keeping her head low, hands in the sleeves of her hoodie, eyes down. She never once looked at us. The guy was smiling in this casual way, like he knew us. His voice carried across the campfire before he even got close enough to fully see his face. Something about our lanterns, something about how cool they looked. Then, without any transition, he said he used to be law enforcement. Just threw it out there like he was listing his favorite beer. Something about it felt off. He kept stepping closer, stopping right at the edge of our firelight. The woman stayed a few feet behind him. Not once did she speak or look up. The guy kept talking about nonsense, where we were from, how long we were staying, what kind of cooler we had. He never commented on the time or how strange it was to walk up on two guys in the middle of the woods this late at night. His flashlight beam moved constantly, not just side to side but down. Over our bags, our tent zippers, the axes, the cooler, even the way our chairs were arranged. It hit me hard and fast. We were being sized up. He was studying our setup like he was taking inventory, figuring out if we had weapons, how many people were here, how close our gear was. His eyes were darting like a guy looking for a camera or trying to spot a back door. The smile never left his face, but the muscles in his neck were tight, and there was this twitch in his left hand that kept pulling at his shorts. Then he turned his light to our tents and said, "Oh, that's where you guys are sleeping, huh? Cool setup." He didn't say it like someone making small talk. It felt like he was confirming something, like he needed to know exactly where we'd be. Tyler was still standing next to me, arms crossed. I glanced over and didn't have to say a word. He was already staring at me with this wide-eyed look I've only seen once before, when we got caught in a lightning storm on a hike years ago. The guy lingered another minute. Then he just nodded, muttered something to his girl, and walked off into the woods. Not down the trail, just sideways into the trees where there was no path, no light. We stood there in silence, watching the light bob farther away until it disappeared completely.
No footsteps, no voices.
Just gone. Tyler turned to me, picked up his bag, and said one thing: "We're packing our shit and getting out of here." We didn't argue. We didn't talk. We moved fast but quiet. Fire out. Tent stakes yanked. Gear tossed into bags. We didn't bother rolling anything, just stuffed and dragged. The whole time I kept scanning the woods with my flashlight, half expecting that guy to step out again, or worse, come from behind. I kept thinking, what if we hadn't been awake when he showed up? What if we'd gone to sleep at midnight like we usually do? We were on the road in under 10 minutes. Drove down that rough trail faster than we should have. Headlights bouncing, tires kicking up gravel. Didn't stop until we hit pavement, and even then we didn't say much. We found a 24-hour gas station 20 miles out and parked in the back lot. That's where we stayed until the sun came up. Neither of us could sleep. I kept replaying it in my head. That guy didn't need anything. He wasn't lost. He wasn't making friendly camp talk. He didn't even ask for help. He was scoping us out. Maybe for a robbery, maybe worse. His girl, I don't know what her deal was. She looked scared, tired, like someone used to following instructions without asking questions. It might not sound like much if you've never had it happen, but if you've ever felt a person studying you, not with curiosity, but with intent, you know the difference. You feel it in your spine. Your chest gets tight. Your brain runs a dozen what-if scenarios in seconds. We talked about it for weeks after, tried to reason it out. Maybe he was high, maybe just a weirdo, but deep down we both knew. He came out there for something, and when he saw we were still up, alert, and aware of him, he backed off. But if we had been asleep, I don't even want to finish that sentence. We still camp, but not like we used to. We keep a weapon nearby. We camp closer to others. We never let the fire die early. And we never ever ignore that guy. Growing up, my parents were always into the outdoors. They weren't the kind of people who talked about it a lot or made it a big deal on social media or anything. They just did it. When they were younger, especially before I was born, they'd go on these long, sometimes borderline reckless trips into the wilderness. Real backcountry stuff, places without cell phone signals or people, where rescue wasn't an option unless you hiked or paddled for days. It's the kind of camping that makes even most campers nervous. That's just how they liked it. One of the stories they always told, sometimes at family get-togethers, sometimes just when we were sitting around our own campfire, was from a canoe trip way out in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Saskatchewan. I didn't believe parts of it when I was younger, especially the part where a bear supposedly sat on my dad. Sounded like a weird campfire joke, but they never told it like a joke. It always had that quiet tone behind it, like it had unsettled them just enough that they didn't enjoy remembering it, but they knew it had to be remembered. Stuck with them. When I got older, I asked for more details. My dad finally gave them, one fall evening after we'd done a hike together and were sitting around the fire. He spoke slowly, calmly, and didn't add anything extra. What I'm about to write here is from that version. I've added some of my own imagination to how things looked and felt, but the core of it, that's all there's. This is my telling of the time a black bear sat on my dad, and why it scared them more than almost anything else they experienced in the wild. They were about 4 days into a 10-day canoe trip. No people for miles. They had driven to a launch point, basically just a gravel turnaround at the end of a dirt forestry road, and paddled deep into a stretch of boreal forest that most people only ever see in books or nature documentaries. Lakes so still they looked like dark glass. Pines that were tall and thick, their branches curling toward the sky like claws. The nights were cold even though it was summer. The bugs were bad but manageable. The air was always thick with the smell of moss and pine needles and the constant wetness of nearby water. Their route was a mix of paddling and portaging, meaning they had to carry their gear and canoe across land between lakes. The slow, exhausting work. They traveled with what they needed: tent, stove, freeze-dried meals, sleeping bags, a small hatchet, some bear spray, maps, and waterproof bags. They never carried a firearm. My dad was a purist that way. He believed in the idea that if you respected nature, it would mostly respect you back. He believed most danger could be avoided by not doing anything stupid. That particular day, they had made good progress. 3 lakes, 2 portages, and they'd found a good patch of land to camp on just before dark. The spot was on a little peninsula, slightly raised, with a narrow stretch of bushes behind the tent site and the lake curving gently around on 3 sides. They set up the tent close to the trees, but not too close, and made their dinner just downwind, as usual, then packed all their food into a sealed barrel and carried it a good distance away from camp. All normal procedures. That night was colder than the ones before. The air had that stillness you only get when the wind dies completely.
No rustling.
No splashing of fish. Just silence, like the whole forest was holding its breath. My parents didn't think much of it. They were used to the silence. They got into their sleeping bags, zipped the tent shut, and went to sleep. Then came the rustling. It was early morning. Not quite dawn, not quite night. That strange gray zone where your body's confused about whether it should be awake or not. The kind of hour where every sound feels like it's happening right next to your head. The first sound was dry leaves moving, then the snapping of a twig. My dad had woken up first. He told me later that he thought it was just a squirrel or something small, but it kept going. A heavier movement, a brushing sound, like something large was shifting through the bushes right behind the tent. He sat up quickly, already on edge, and tried to listen. The sound grew louder, shuffling, snorting, breathing. Something was there, close. He started to unzip his sleeping bag, not sure if he should get out to investigate or just wait. Then the tent collapsed. Not all of it, just one side, his side. Something heavy had landed on it, pushed the whole wall of the tent inward and onto his chest. He couldn't breathe properly for a second. There was real weight on him, not like a branch falling. He knew that immediately. This was soft and heavy, like a body, not a human one. The wait only lasted a few seconds. Whatever it was seemed to realize it had hit something unexpected and pulled away fast. The tent wall sprang back up a little, but the structure was bent and sagging where it had been impacted. My dad scrambled, heart racing, lungs still catching up, trying to get out of his bag. My mom was awake now too. They both unzipped the flap and looked outside. About 10 feet away, standing still in the low morning light, was a black bear. It wasn't aggressive. In fact, it looked confused, even a little scared. Its ears were up, its head tilted slightly, and it was just staring at them. The bear had probably been foraging in the bushes behind the tent. There were lots of berry bushes back there, and the ground sloped a bit toward the tent. If the bear had stepped wrong or lost its balance while walking through the brush, it would have easily stumbled forward and landed on the tent and on my dad. It stood there for maybe 10 seconds, 10 long, tense, wordless seconds. Then, still looking alert but not angry, the bear slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees like it had never been there. Now, on paper, or to someone who's never been out in true wilderness, that might sound almost funny. A bear lost its footing and accidentally sat on a tent. End of story, right? But my dad said it shook him in a way that few things ever had. Not just because of the weight or the surprise, but because of how close they'd come to something worse without even realizing it. He couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if the bear had reacted differently, if it had panicked, if it had slashed out with its claws after falling, if it had turned on them when they came out of the tent, or if it had simply been more curious and decided to investigate further instead of running off. They had no time to prepare, no warning, just sudden impact, then a face-to-face with a wild animal capable of killing them both in seconds. After the bear left, they didn't go back to sleep. They packed up camp slowly, silently. My dad said every muscle in his body was tight the entire time. The trees felt different. Every sound seemed louder. The normal calm of the forest was gone. They didn't say much to each other that morning. They ate a cold breakfast, skipped the coffee, and got back in the canoe. It wasn't until the middle of the lake, paddling hard and steady, that he let himself relax even a little. They didn't cut the trip short, but they never camped that close to bushes again. Every site after that was chosen with more caution, more visibility, more space. My dad said it made him realize how fast things can change, that even when you do everything right, there are still moments you can't control. Nature doesn't care how prepared you are. It just is. The tent had a long rip where the bear had landed. 3 of the poles were bent. My dad fixed it with duct tape and spare cord. They kept using it for years afterward. Every time they pitched it, they saw that taped up side, and they remembered the morning when a bear landed on their tent in the middle of nowhere. It didn't become a funny story until much later. And even then, it only became funny to us, their kids. I think for them, it was always something more serious. A reminder of how thin the line is between a quiet morning and a disaster. To this day, my dad says he can still feel the exact pressure of that weight on his chest. Not pain, just pressure. Like something enormous had settled down on top of him without warning. He says the scariest part was that the bear hadn't meant to be threatening. It had just slipped, and that's what made it worse. If it had been aggressive, there would have been something to fight or run from or react to. But this was different. This was just a reminder of how easily things can go wrong out there. One misstep, one bit of bad luck. Sometimes the wilderness isn't trying to hurt you. Sometimes it just doesn't know you're there. And sometimes, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, it might just sit on you by accident. That's how my dad tells it. Calmly, clearly, never as a joke. And when he finishes, he always says the same thing, asterisk asterisk. That was the moment I stopped thinking I was in control out there. And honestly, I believe him. I've been hunting upland birds for years, usually out early mornings when the air is still cool and the light just begins to spill over the hills. It's a quiet, peaceful way to spend a day, walking slow through the bush, watching the ground and the low branches for movement, listening to the birds themselves. I'm not one for shooting much else, but the birds, well, they're a different story. This particular morning, The sky was a pale gray, with heavy clouds rolling in low, promising rain before noon. The kind of weather that makes the woods feel thick and damp, smells sharp with pine and wet earth. I had set out early, my boots crunching over twigs and dry leaves, my shotgun slung across my shoulder, and a small pack with some essentials strapped to my back. I knew the areas well, but today I wanted to check out a part of the woods I hadn't been to in a while, a little farther from the main trails. After a couple of hours wandering along the usual ridges, I decided to take a shortcut through a small valley I knew of. A narrow hollow with a creek that ran through it, surrounded by thick brush and tangled undergrowth. It wasn't a path often used by hikers or other hunters, but it cut the distance down nicely and had some good spots where I'd seen grouse before. The valley was shadowed by tall oaks and maples, their branches woven together so the sun barely touched the ground. I stepped carefully over roots and loose rocks, moving slow, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. A sudden flutter of feathers, a flash of brown or red against the green. The quiet was nearly complete except for the soft burble of the creek and my own breath. At times, I paused to listen more closely, the way I always do out there, alert to the small noises that mean a bird is near. It's a skill you build after many years in the bush. About halfway through the valley, the narrow trail curved around a dense thicket of brambles and berry bushes. As I rounded the bend, I suddenly stopped dead. Up ahead, standing square in the middle of the path, was a man. He was holding an AR-15 at the ready position, the barrel pointing toward me but not quite aimed. His eyes were hard and cold, a wild look on his face, like someone who hadn't slept or eaten properly for days. He looked rough, dirty clothes, ragged hair matted to his scalp, a beard full of grit. His skin was pale and tight over his cheekbones, like he'd lost a lot of weight fast. The smell of him hit me. Sweat, dirt, something sour and chemical-like. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up instantly. Something about him didn't feel right. The kind of feeling you get when your body knows before your brain does. I tried to keep my breathing steady, to appear calm, but my heart was pounding hard in my chest. He didn't move, just stood there, rifle in hand, watching me. I raised my hands slightly, not in surrender but to show I wasn't a threat. "Hey, just out bird hunting. How are you doing?" I said, my voice steady but low. He answered with a simple, "Fine," and then a long pause before adding, "I'm hunting deer." The problem was, I knew deer season hadn't opened yet, and you couldn't legally use an AR-15 to hunt deer anyway. Plus, he wasn't dressed for it. No camo, no orange, just layers of dirty clothes hanging off his thin frame. It all clicked in my head. This guy was dangerous, maybe not just some hunter out enjoying the day. More like someone who had been out here for a while, maybe hiding or worse. I needed to get out of there, but not in a way that would spook him into doing something rash. "Do you know the best way for me to go to find some birds?" I asked, trying to keep the tone casual. His voice got sharper, like he was annoyed or impatient. "Well, I imagine you might find some back the way you came." It was a clear hint, and I took it. Slowly, keeping my eyes on him, I backed up a few steps, turned, and headed back the way I had come, trying not to run but moving fast enough that I wouldn't stay in that valley any longer than I had to. The whole way back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, but he didn't follow. I made it out to the main trail, feeling a knot of tension in my stomach. I could still see the valley in the distance, the place where that man had been standing. I wondered if he had a camp nearby, or if there was something else, maybe a meth lab or a stash of stolen goods hidden down that trail. It was hard to say, but I wasn't about to find out. The next morning, I drove into town and reported the incident to the sheriff's office. I told them everything, the man's appearance, the weapon, the location. The deputy said they would look into it, but I never heard anything more. No news about a suspect or a raid. Nothing. I went back out to the woods a few times after that, but I stayed clear of that valley. Each time, I'd walk those other trails, keeping a careful eye out, listening for any sign that the man might still be around. Months passed and life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be when you carry the memory of something like that with you. It wasn't the usual kind of scary story you hear around a campfire with ghosts or monsters. It was something far more real, far more dangerous. The knowledge that out there, in the quiet woods you think you know so well, there can be people who don't belong, people who are armed and unpredictable and willing to do whatever it takes to protect whatever secret they're hiding. I still go hunting upland birds when the season's right, but I never forget that day in the valley. Every time I walk the trails, I remember how quickly things can change, how a peaceful day can turn into something tense and dangerous in just a few seconds. And that's why, no matter how much you love the woods, you always have to respect the unknown. Because sometimes, the scariest thing out there isn't a wild animal or a ghost story. It's another human being, and you never know what they're capable of. I never thought a camping trip would scare me this badly, but out there in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, it did. We were a group of 6, all friends who liked to get away from the city noise, to breathe fresh air and get some dirt under our nails. We weren't pros by any means, just some guys who liked to fish, hike, and camp. We chose a spot far from any paved road, maybe an hour or more of bumpy driving from the nearest highway, deep enough in the desert that the nearest neighbor was probably a mile or 2 away, or more. The first day was all good. We rolled into the spot in the afternoon, trucks loaded with gear and food and coolers full of beer and water. The sun was brutal, the sky stretched wide and blue, and the land around us was dry, rocky, with scattered bushes and scraggly trees that barely gave shade. We picked a flat spot near a small dry wash, a shallow creek bed that was mostly dry this time of year but promised some water during the rainy season. It was quiet except for the sound of wind through the desert brush and a few birds circling overhead. We set up 2 tents. One was a big 12-person tent that took all of us, and the other was a smaller 2-person for the couple in the group. Our site had a picnic table and a fire ring made of stones, already arranged from some past campers who'd been here before. After a few hours getting everything ready, we went for a quick hike to explore the area. We saw a few lizards darting over the rocks, some vultures soaring in the sky, and a jackrabbit that bolted the moment we got too close. As evening came, the temperature dropped fast. The desert heat vanished quickly once the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a cold that crept under your skin if you weren't careful. We lit a fire and sat around it, the flames crackling and popping as we roasted some hot dogs and warmed up cans of beans. The sky filled with stars, brighter than I'd ever seen in the city, a wide glittering ceiling overhead. We drank some beer, laughed at stupid jokes, and just relaxed. It was perfect, or so I thought. That night, I slept in the big tent with 3 other friends. We had our sleeping bags spread out on the tent floor, backs to the canvas walls, ears tuned to the silence of the desert night. The wind occasionally rustled dry leaves outside, and every now and then, an owl hooted somewhere far off. But nothing seemed out of place, until I woke up. First, it was just a faint noise, a soft, irregular sniffing. It sounded like someone or something was sniffing the air, the kind of noise you hear when an animal tries to get a sense of its surroundings. The sound was coming from right outside our tent, close enough that I could clearly hear it pressing against the canvas. My heart jumped. I froze, waiting. The sniffing continued, slow, careful, deliberate. The first thing I thought was that it was a bear or some animal that had wandered into the campsite. Maybe a coyote, a raccoon, or a bobcat. Or maybe some other critter searching for food. Then it struck me we'd been careless. We'd left some garbage tied up but not secured well enough. Maybe some of the guys had left snacks or drinks out by accident. This would explain the animal sniffing around. I glanced at my friends, who were also awake now. We all shared a look without a word, eyes wide in the dim light filtering through the tense fabric. Everyone was alert, waiting, trying to be as quiet as possible. The sniffing moved away from our tent, just for a second, before returning, this time shifting towards the tent next to ours. It was the other 2-person tent, where the couple was sleeping. The sound was the same slow, deliberate sniffing, the kind that felt too focused to be an animal just wandering. Then a sudden movement. The flap of the other tent cracked open, and a voice shouted. A scream, actually loud and sharp, cutting through the night air. There was the sound of a gun being raised and fired once. The noise startled the thing outside. The sniffing stopped. I could hear footsteps running away, fading fast into the darkness. We scrambled out of the tent, grabbing flashlights, shining beams all around. That's when we saw him. A man standing a short distance from our sight, just beyond the firelight's reach. His clothes were dirty, and his face was half hidden under a scruffy beard and tangled hair. He was holding a small bag, and nearby, an open cooler lay empty. Our food had been ransacked. It wasn't an animal at all. He was a trespasser, a stranger who had sneaked into our camp in the middle of the night, going through our stuff, sniffing our tents like some sort of animal himself. The thought made my stomach churn. Our friend shouted again, warning him off, and the man took off running into the desert, disappearing quickly into the shadows. We didn't say much. We knew what to do. We packed up fast. Everything. Coolers, tents, gear, we stuffed it all back into the trucks. Nobody wanted to stay there another second. The drive back to town was tense and quiet. No one said much. We all knew we'd been lucky this time. A year later, some of the same friends talked me into going back out there, convinced that the incident had been a one-time thing. They figured whoever that guy was, he probably wouldn't show up again. This time, we'd be smarter. No tents. Instead, we all decided to sleep in the backs of our trucks and SUVs. Sleeping in the beds of our trucks seemed safer. At least that's what we told ourselves. A car is a locked, enclosed space. No stranger can just walk up and start sniffing around a vehicle like it was a tent. We picked a spot not far from the original site, but with more room for all the vehicles to park in a circle around the fire pit. The night was quiet. After some beers and a quick dinner cooked on the grill, we all climbed into our trucks and settled down for sleep. I was in the back of my SUV with my girlfriend, lying on an air mattress, wrapped in blankets. I felt safe, comfortable even despite the desert cold. The fire crackled a short distance away where a friend was still sitting, likely asleep. And then, out of nowhere, a bright light shone directly in my face. I woke up instantly but forced myself to stay still and pretend I was asleep. The beam was steady and intense, shining through the rear window of the SUV, blinding me if I opened my eyes. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My girlfriend was next to me. I hoped she was playing the same game. I could hear footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. The light moved from my window to the next vehicle and then the next, scanning the parked trucks and SUVs. I kept my eyes shut tight and listened for anything unusual. There was only the soft sound of the wind, the fire crackling faintly, and the steady, slow breathing of my friends pretending to sleep. When the light finally moved away from our vehicles and into the dark distance beyond the campsite, I waited a few moments, then slipped out of the SUV. I crept over to my friends and woke them up quietly. One by one, they admitted to having played dead, realizing the same thing I did. Someone was out there, creeping through the camp, shining lights and watching us sleep. The feeling of being watched in the dark, vulnerable and exposed, stayed with me long after we left. I'm telling you all this to warn anyone thinking about camping out there near Tucson, Arizona. It's not all scenic views and peaceful nights. There are people out there, people who don't belong and who don't respect boundaries. They walk around in the night, sniffing around your stuff, watching while you try to sleep, and you never really know what they might do if they catch you off guard. We never saw that man again, but we never forgot him either. It changed how we saw camping. It changed how we felt about the open desert at night. After that, I always made sure to camp in places with other people around, where there was cell service and where I could get help if things went wrong. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what nature throws at you, it's what people do. If you want, I can continue with a very expanded version of the story, adding deep layers of description about the environment, the smells, the sounds, the feeling of waiting, the detailed process of packing gear, setting up camp, the slow horror of hearing something sniff your tent, the rush of adrenaline when you hear footsteps outside, the tense moments waiting for the intruder, the overwhelming sense of relief mixed with fear when the man runs off, and the quiet, nervous drive back to safety. I can also add an equally detailed account of the second camping trip, where every moment is soaked in tension, the dread of being watched and the feeling of helplessness, ending with the moment the flashlight beam hits your face. If you want me to do that, just say the word, and I will build a full, immersive, very long story exactly to your specs. living in a tiny town with barely 200 people, tucked away between woods and a lonely highway, seemed like the perfect quiet place for me to work from my laptop and get some peace. It wasn't exactly camping, but I was staying in a small cabin in the woods, far enough off the main road to feel secluded, but close enough to hear the occasional car drive by. My dog was my only company, a steady presence that made the silence less heavy. Life was slow, simple, or at least that's how it started. The woods around the cabin were thick, full of old trees and underbrush that brushed up close to the cabin walls. There was no one close by, not in sight anyway. The closest neighbors were at least half a kilometer, sometimes a full kilometer away, hidden behind those thick trees. That made the isolation feel heavier, even if the highway was near enough to remind me I wasn't completely alone. One afternoon, I was out walking my dog along the edge of the woods, near the highway, when I heard two loud gunshots ring out in the distance. The sound bounced off the trees, sharp and sudden. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out where it came from. But the woods stretched on, silent and still, except for the distant hum of cars. I didn't think much of it. The area was known for hunting, and people there were rough and rednecky. Gunshots weren't unusual in places like that, especially around hunting season. The next day, or maybe it was the day after, time was hard to keep track of in the quiet. A big old truck pulled up outside my cabin. That was strange. I didn't know anyone in that town besides a few shopkeepers, and none of them had stopped by like that. The truck slowed down, dust kicking up from the dirt driveway, and the driver got out. He was a tall, rough-looking guy, wearing old boots and a cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was weathered, like he'd spent years in the sun, and his stare felt heavy and unreadable. He said he was my neighbor. I wasn't sure what to say. He was the first person in that part of the woods I'd seen since I moved in. I nodded, keeping my dog close by. He asked if I'd heard the gunshots a few days ago. I said yeah. He said it was his neighbor who fired them, shooting at his house over a land dispute. It was a quick story, said without any real emotion or explanation. I didn't ask questions. The whole thing felt off. The way he said neighbor was loose, like it could have been anyone within a mile radius. Definitely not someone I'd ever met before or wanted to meet. While he was standing there, my dog started digging at some dirt near the edge of the cabin. The guy's eyes flicked to her, and suddenly he began telling her to stop. His voice was low and sharp, strange in a way I couldn't place. Then he got out of the truck and came closer. My dog stiffened, her tail lowering. He crouched down and called her over in a way that made my skin crawl. I watched as he grabbed her roughly, flipping her onto her back and holding her down like some kind of alpha dog. The Cesar Chavez dominance thing, or whatever it's called. She yelped, struggling, and I told him to stop, but he ignored me. That was the moment I realized how weird this guy really was. It wasn't just the way he spoke or the story about the gunshots. It was the whole energy around him, like he was testing me or sizing me up. Then he asked if I had any guns. I said no, which was true. He smiled thinly and said he was a great dog trainer. He then asked if I could mow his lawn sometime, and oddly, told me to please ensure to bring / my dog's name. The way he said it, like it was an order but also a warning, was chilling. It wasn't a normal neighborly request. Felt like a demand, or maybe a trap. He left soon after that, the truck rumbling down the dirt road. But the feeling stuck with me. I realized I just told the stranger I had no weapons, that I heard the gunshots, and maybe that was a mistake. What if he wasn't just telling me about his neighbor? What if he was the one who fired those shots? What if something worse happened? Something I didn't want to think about. For days after, he kept showing up. Not always at the cabin, but around town or near the road where I walked my dog. He called and texted me a lot, asking why I hadn't come over to mow his lawn yet. I had given him my number before realizing how strange and dangerous he seemed. His messages were persistent, almost desperate. I didn't answer, but just having his number made me uneasy. The small store owners, sensing my discomfort, told me more about the guy. He was a local drunk, had lost his wife, his job, everything that gave him reason to live. They said he was dangerous, unstable, and hated by nearly everyone in the valley. My gut told me to stay away, but the isolation of the cabin made me feel trapped in that silence with only my dog for protection. Sleeping became impossible. The cabin was small and quiet, but every window showed the dark woods outside, places where someone could sneak up unseen. I had a can of bear spray and a knife, but that was it. No guns, no alarm system. I would lie awake for hours, straining to hear the slightest noise, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making my heart race. Then came the night I'll never forget. The darkness was thick, the kind that swallows every shape and sound. My dog started growling softly, a low, warning sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then the growling turned louder, more urgent, like she smelled something I couldn't hear. I stayed still, listening. The silence around the cabin was so complete it pressed in on me. No cars on the highway, no wind in the trees, just the growl from my dog, rising and falling, mixed with her paw scratching at the floor as she moved nervously near the door. I grabbed my knife and bear spray, feeling the cold metal and plastic in my hands. Then I locked myself in the bathroom, the only room without a window, and waited. Every minute stretched out like hours. I kept listening for any sound outside. Footsteps, breathing, anything, but nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep on the cold tile floor, clutching my knife. The next morning, nothing had happened. No footprints, no signs of anyone lurking. But I knew the danger was real. The guy was out there somewhere, and he knew I was unarmed. He had the advantage. The whole town seemed to be hiding pieces of a story I didn't want to be part of. As if things couldn't get worse, the landlords who rented me the cabin after that man's truck left turned out to be just as strange, if not worse. They had 3 dogs of their own, but for some reason, they started trying to take mine from me. I overheard them one morning, whispering about how they wanted to make themselves the in crowd, so my dog would prefer them over me. They fed her treats behind my back and watched closely to see if I noticed. It was surreal, feeling like I was living in a small town nightmare where even strangers weren't safe. Their behavior made me feel watched, trapped, like I couldn't trust anyone. One morning, when the landlords left for the market, I packed up everything, my belongings, my dog, and whatever I could grab quickly. I didn't have insurance or a license on my van, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave that place far behind me. I drove away from that cursed little town, the woods shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. The silence of those nights, the creeping dread, the strange men and women who watched and whispered, it all stayed with me. I never looked back. It was the kind of place where you don't just camp or live quietly. It's a place where the quiet is alive and it watches you just as much as you watch it. Those woods were full of secrets and danger, and I was lucky to get out when I did. Sometimes, I think about how close I came to something terrible. A man with nothing to lose, a dark night, and no one around to hear me scream. That was the kind of fear that stays with you long after you're gone. I'll never forget that cabin, the woods, or the feeling of being hunted in a place no one else seemed to care about. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that don't have monsters or ghosts, just people and what they're willing to do when there's no one around to stop them. Living in a tiny town with barely 200 people, tucked away between woods and a lonely highway, seemed like the perfect quiet place for me to work from my laptop and get some peace. It wasn't exactly camping, but I was staying in a small cabin in the woods, far enough off the main road to feel secluded, but close enough to hear the occasional car drive by. My dog was my only company, a steady presence that made the silence less heavy. Life was slow, simple, or at least that's how it started. The woods around the cabin were thick, full of old trees and underbrush that brushed up close to the cabin walls. There was no one close by, not in sight anyway. The closest neighbors were at least half a kilometer, sometimes a full kilometer away, hidden behind those thick trees. That made the isolation feel heavier, even if the highway was near enough to remind me I wasn't completely alone. One afternoon, I was out walking my dog along the edge of the woods, near the highway, when I heard 2 loud gunshots ring out in the distance. The sound bounced off the trees, sharp and sudden. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out where it came from. But the woods stretched on, silent and still, except for the distant hum of cars. I didn't think much of it. The area was known for hunting, and people there were rough and rednecky. Gunshots weren't unusual in places like that, especially around hunting season. The next day, or maybe it was the day after, time was hard to keep track of in the quiet. A big old truck pulled up outside my cabin. That was strange. I didn't know anyone in that town besides a few shopkeepers, and none of them had stopped by like that. The truck slowed down, dust kicking up from the dirt driveway, and the driver got out. He was a tall, rough-looking guy, wearing old boots and a cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was weathered, like he'd spent years in the sun, and his stare felt heavy and unreadable. He said he was my neighbor. I wasn't sure what to say. He was the first person in that part of the woods I'd seen since I moved in. I nodded, keeping my dog close by. He asked if I'd heard the gunshots a few days ago. I said yeah. He said it was his neighbor who fired them, shooting at his house over a land dispute. It was a quick story, said without any real emotion or explanation. I didn't ask questions. The whole thing felt off. The way he said neighbor was loose, like it could have been anyone within a mile radius. Definitely not someone I'd ever met before or wanted to meet. While he was standing there, my dog started digging at some dirt near the edge of the cabin. The guy's eyes flicked to her, and suddenly he began telling her to stop. His voice was low and sharp, strange in a way I couldn't place. Then he got out of the truck and came closer. My dog stiffened, her tail lowering. He crouched down and called her over in a way that made my skin crawl. I watched as he grabbed her roughly, flipping her onto her back and holding her down like some kind of alpha dog. The Cesar Chavez dominance thing, or whatever it's called. She yelped, struggling, and I told him to stop, but he ignored me. That was the moment I realized how weird this guy really was. It wasn't just the way he spoke or the story about the gunshots. It was the whole energy around him, like he was testing me or sizing me up. Then he asked if I had any guns. I said no, which was true. He smiled thinly and said he was a great dog trainer. He then asked if I could mow his lawn sometime, and oddly, told me to please ensure to bring / my dog's name. The way he said it, like it was an order but also a warning, was chilling. It wasn't a normal neighborly request. Felt like a demand, or maybe a trap. He left soon after that, the truck rumbling down the dirt road. But the feeling stuck with me. I realized I just told the stranger I had no weapons, that I heard the gunshots, and maybe that was a mistake. What if he wasn't just telling me about his neighbor? What if he was the one who fired those shots? What if something worse happened? Something I didn't want to think about. For days after, he kept showing up. Not always at the cabin, but around town or near the road where I walked my dog. He called and texted me a lot, asking why I hadn't come over to mow his lawn yet. I had given him my number before realizing how strange and dangerous he seemed. His messages were persistent, almost desperate. I didn't answer, but just having his number made me uneasy. The small store owners, sensing my discomfort, told me more about the guy. He was a local drunk, had lost his wife, his job, everything that gave him reason to live. They said he was dangerous, unstable, and hated by nearly everyone in the valley. My gut told me to stay away, but the isolation of the cabin made me feel trapped in that silence with only my dog for protection. Sleeping became impossible. The cabin was small and quiet, but every window showed the dark woods outside, places where someone could sneak up unseen. I had a can of bear spray and a knife, but that was it. No guns, no alarm system. I would lie awake for hours, straining to hear the slightest noise, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves making my heart race. Then came the night I'll never forget. The darkness was thick, the kind that swallows every shape and sound. My dog started growling softly, a low, warning sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then the growling turned louder, more urgent, like she smelled something I couldn't hear. I stayed still, listening. The silence around the cabin was so complete it pressed in on me. No cars on the highway, no wind in the trees, just the growl from my dog, rising and falling, mixed with her paw scratching at the floor as she moved nervously near the door. I grabbed my knife and bear spray, feeling the cold metal and plastic in my hands. Then I locked myself in the bathroom, the only room without a window, and waited. Every minute stretched out like hours. I kept listening for any sound outside. Footsteps, breathing, anything. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep on the cold tile floor, clutching my knife. The next morning, nothing had happened. No footprints, no signs of anyone lurking. But I knew the danger was real. The guy was out there somewhere, and he knew I was unarmed. He had the advantage. The whole town seemed to be hiding pieces of a story I didn't want to be part of. As if things couldn't get worse, the landlords who rented me the cabin after that man's truck left turned out to be just as strange, if not worse. They had 3 dogs of their own, but for some reason, they started trying to take mine from me. I overheard them one morning, whispering about how they wanted to make themselves the in-crowd, so my dog would prefer them over me. They fed her treats behind my back and watched closely to see if I noticed. It was surreal, feeling like I was living in a small-town nightmare where even strangers weren't safe. Their behavior made me feel watched, trapped, like I couldn't trust anyone. One morning, when the landlords left for the market, I packed up everything, my belongings, my dog, and whatever I could grab quickly. I didn't have insurance or a license on my van, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave that place far behind me. I drove away from that cursed little town, the woods shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror, the silence of those nights, the creeping dread, the strange men and women who watched and whispered. It all stayed with me. I never looked back. It was the kind of place where you don't just camp or live quietly. It's a place where the quiet is alive and it watches you just as much as you watch it. Those woods were full of secrets and danger, and I was lucky to get out when I did. Sometimes, I think about how close I came to something terrible. A man with nothing to lose, a dark night, and no one around to hear me scream. That was the kind of fear that stays with you long after you're gone. I'll never forget that cabin, the woods, or the feeling of being hunted in a place no one else seemed to care about. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that don't have monsters or ghosts, just people, and what they're willing to do when there's no one around to stop them. I've spent a lot of time camping. Sometimes it's just me, sometimes my wife, sometimes my dog or my best friend. The thing is, the woods are peaceful until they're not. You don't need ghosts or monsters to get spooked out there. Nature's got a way of reminding you how small and out of control you really are. And people are the wildest part of the wilderness, if you ask me. There are 3 trips I've had that really stuck with me. One made me genuinely scared for my life. Another made me feel like I stumbled into something I shouldn't have seen. And the last, that one was just pure chaos, the kind that leaves you wondering how you even got out safe. Let me tell you about them. I'll start with the windstorm. This trip was supposed to be a simple getaway. My wife and I had been working nonstop and needed a break. We picked a quiet campground deep in the woods, surrounded by dense jack pine forest. It wasn't a popular spot. No amenities, no camp store, no hookups. Just a few marked clearings and a fire ring at each site. That's how we liked it. We got there in the afternoon, picked a spot near a small creek, and got to work setting up the tent. The air was cool but still. You know that kind of silence the forest has when everything's too calm?
No birds chirping, no breeze.
I should have taken that as a warning. We had a basic setup, a 12-person tent that was more than enough space for the 2 of us, a collapsible table, and our cooking gear. We made a small dinner, watched the fire crackle as the sun went down, then crawled into our sleeping bags. Everything felt fine. I fell asleep thinking it'd be a peaceful night. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of wind. Not just a breeze. This was a deep, rumbling wind that sounded like it was pushing the whole forest sideways. I lay there listening as it built and built, getting louder every few seconds. Then I heard it, trees cracking. I sat up, wide awake now, heart thudding. The wind was howling, and it wasn't stopping. The tent was flapping hard enough to snap poles. I unzipped the door and looked out with my headlamp. The trees, Tall, narrow jack pines were swaying like blades of grass, and then one snapped. I didn't see it fall, but I heard the crack, like a gunshot, followed by a heavy crash as it hit the ground. Branches started raining down on the tent. Pine needles, too. The ground was littered with them, whipping around like they were trying to cut skin. I shook my wife awake, and we both threw on boots and jackets. I didn't know what to do at first. Running into the woods seemed insane, but staying in the tent felt suicidal. Every gust sounded like it could take down the tree next to us. We crouched outside the tent, far enough from trees to avoid direct hits, but not far enough to be truly safe. I saw 2 trees fall in the distance, just tilt, groan, and go down like they were nothing. The ground shook when they hit. It lasted maybe an hour, maybe less, but it felt endless. When it finally calmed down, the forest was unrecognizable. Needles and broken branches covered everything. One whole tree had fallen maybe 30 feet from our tent, completely blocking the path out. We were lucky. If it had gone the other way, it would have crushed us. We packed up just enough to get moving and hiked out before sunrise, carrying what we could. I had to bushwhack around the downed tree to get the car, which was parked a quarter mile down a rough trail. We didn't talk much on the way home. We didn't camp for a long time after that. A year or so after that, I went camping with my best friend. This spot was different. Remote, but not true backcountry. You could drive to it if you had a good 4x4. There was no cell service, and the road in was barely more than a trail. The campground wasn't maintained regularly. Just a couple fire rings, some rotting picnic tables, and 2 wooden outhouses that looked like they hadn't seen a ranger in a year. We pulled in around midday. No one else was there. It wasn't surprising. This place was pretty out of the way. We picked a flat clearing near the edge of the woods and started unloading. I was setting up the stove and unpacking gear when my buddy wandered toward the outhouses. I figured he just needed to go. A few minutes later, he came back and said I should check out the first outhouse. I figured it was gross, or maybe something got in and died in there. We've all seen that, raccoons, squirrels, whatever. They fall in and can't get back out. I walked over, opened the door, and stopped cold. Inside were 3 huge backpacks. I'm talking full 80-liter packs. The kind you'd take for a week in the backcountry. They were stacked neatly, one against each wall, like someone had placed them there on purpose. I dragged one out into the light and unzipped it. It was full of camping gear. Quality stuff too: stove, fuel, sleeping bag, utensils, even a sealed food bag. Nothing looked old or broken. It was like someone packed for a long trip and left it there. I opened the second. Same deal. More gear, all in good shape. No ID, no names, nothing to say whose it was. The third one was different. The second I unzipped it, I got hit with a sweet, fruity smell. It was full of Skittles. Every kind. Big party bags, little ones, those weird tropical flavors you never see in stores anymore. The pack was completely full. Skittles in every pocket. I don't even know how someone bought that many or why they would. We looked around, thinking maybe someone was coming back for them. But the site was dead quiet. No tire tracks, no footprints. Nothing looked touched in days. We stayed for nights. Never saw a single person. The pack stayed where we found them. Before we left a note inside the outhouse saying we found the packs and told whoever might come by next to report them if needed. When we got back to civilization, we called Parks and left a message. They said they'd check it out when they did their seasonal run. I never heard anything more. I have no idea what happened. Maybe someone bailed on their trip. Maybe they had a medical emergency and left the gear. But why stash it in an outhouse? And who packs 80 liters of Skittles? It still makes the hair on my arms stand up thinking about it. There's something not right about that. The third trip was one I took alone with my dog. I wasn't planning on it. I had a couple days off work, and the weather looked good. So I threw my pack in the truck, grabbed the dog, and headed out. This wasn't a well-known trail, just a logging road that curved deep into the forest, with a few spurs branching off. I knew the area from old maps and figured I'd do a short overnight, nothing too ambitious. I parked off one of the older roads and hiked in maybe a mile. Found a flat spot behind a ridge, set up a tarp, and got a small fire going. No tent this time, just the tarp and a ground sheet. I like doing that sometimes. You feel more in touch with the forest, and the dog loves it. It was a quiet evening. Cooked some rice and sausage over the fire, let the dog sniff around, then bundled up and lay down just as the stars were coming out. The fire was low, but I kept it going a little longer than usual. Something about the silence didn't sit right. Around midnight, I started dozing off. The dog was curled up next to me, still awake. Then I heard it, a truck somewhere close. The engine roared, tires spinning on gravel, echoing off the trees. I figured it was on the other side of the ridge, maybe half a mile. Still way too close for comfort. Then the shouting started. Loud, slurred voices. Laughing, yelling, stuff I couldn't make out. Then came the gunshots. I've been around guns my whole life. I know the difference between a .22 and a shotgun, between a warning shot and someone just fooling around. These weren't careful shots. These were wild, fast, like someone playing cowboy in the woods. 3, 4, 5 shots. Then more yelling. I lay still, heart pounding. The dog was pressed against my leg, ears up, muscles tight. I didn't move. I waited, hoping they'd get bored and leave. But the shots kept coming. And based on the way sound travels in that area, I realized something terrifying. They were firing in my direction. They probably had no idea I was there. I hadn't seen a single car or hiker all day. I was camped low in a fold between ridges, and my truck was parked on a different road from the one they were probably using. I doubt they even knew I was nearby, but that didn't make it any safer. I clipped the leash on the dog, stuffed my essentials, knife, water, flashlight, lighter, into my coat, and left everything else. We moved slow at first, then faster once we were past the bend of the ridge. I didn't use my light unless I had to. The forest was rough, and I took a few branches to the face. The dog stayed right next to me, like he knew this wasn't a normal walk. It took me over an hour to make it back to the truck, partly because I was trying to avoid making noise, and partly because I was scared stiff. I drove out with my lights off for the first half mile, then flipped them on once I hit the main road. I didn't see anyone on the way out. No truck, no sign of other people. I never reported it. Who would I even tell? Some guys were drunk and shooting in the woods? I didn't get a plate, didn't see faces. Nothing illegal on paper. Just stupid, dangerous behavior. But it changed the way I camp. I still go out. I still I live in a small rural town, nestled deep in the foothills of a mountain range that stretches wide and tall, surrounding us like a fortress made of stone and ancient trees. The forests here are dense, thick with pine and cedar, mixed with old oaks and maples. The air carries the scent of pine sap and earth, especially in spring and fall. In winter, the forest becomes a quiet place, covered in white snow and a stillness so complete it can almost feel like the trees are holding their breath. For someone like me, who grew up here, camping is as natural as breathing. It's part of the rhythm of life, almost weekly in the warmer months, and often even in winter if the weather's good enough. The story I'm about to tell you is the one camping experience I can't shake. It's the one that stayed with me long after the fire's been put out and the last ember has died down. Even now, years later, it returns to my mind whenever I'm out in the woods, quiet and alone, staring at the dark shapes of trees beneath the stars. It happened when I was 16, a summer just before I was about to start my junior year of high school. Me and a group of friends, 15 of us all together, boys and girls mostly between 16 and 19, had planned a weekend camping trip. We wanted to get out of town, out of the buzz and noise, to spend a few days fishing, hiking, and sleeping under the stars. The plan was simple. Set up camp near the river by the edge of the forest and fish during the day. Most of us were pretty used to camping already. We had all grown up around the woods, but this trip was bigger than usual, more of a group outing than just family or small circles. We had one large tent for the whole group, a big dome tent with enough space for about 6 or 7 people. The rest of us took makeshift shelters or hammocks, or simply slept out under the sky if we wanted. But as the afternoon stretched into evening, 2 of us, me and my friend Jason, decided to break off from the group. The main camp was set near a bend in the river that was good for fishing, but a little crowded and noisy with all the other kids there. Jason had heard about a spot about a mile downriver that was supposed to have better fishing, more secluded, a place where you could catch bigger fish without the noise and the distraction of the rest of the group. We didn't bring the big tent with us. We only had one, and that stayed with the main group. Instead, we built a simple lean-to shelter using some large branches and logs against a huge boulder that stood like a silent giant in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. The lean-to wasn't fancy by any means, just enough to break the wind and keep off some of the chill at night. We laid down some pine boughs and old leaves to make a softer bed and arranged some logs nearby for a fire ring. I remember the evening was clear, the sky a deep, dark blue, and the full moon hanging low and bright above the tree line. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting long, thin shadows across the forest floor and lighting the clearing in a cold, pale glow. We made a fire out of dry wood and pine needles, small crackling flames licking the air and sending sparks upward where they disappeared into the night. The fire gave off a warm orange light that pushed back the cold and the darkness, and it was the only real barrier between us and the vast woods. Jason was quieter than usual that night. He was usually talkative and joking, but now he seemed a little tense, scanning the tree line every now and then, his eyes sharp and alert. I tried to shake off a feeling of unease that had settled over me. It was the kind of feeling that creeps up when you're deep in the woods, that sense of being watched, of something out there just beyond sight. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Mountain lions live here, sure, but they don't usually come this close. I'd spent enough time in the mountains to know their behavior. They hunt mostly at dawn or dusk and tend to avoid humans. When I've seen them before, they've been cautious, almost shy, keeping their distance unless cornered. It wasn't unusual to hear the distant cry of one in the night or find tracks near a trail. Still, the feeling of eyes on us didn't go away. I added more logs to the fire, the crackling and popping of burning wood filling the quiet. The warmth of the fire made me feel safer, but my heart still thumped unevenly. I glanced up from the flames, expecting maybe to see a deer or a raccoon moving through the trees. Instead, something else caught my eye. At the edge of the clearing, about 80 yards away, standing still beneath the moonlight, was a man. I could barely make out details. His clothes were dark, blending into the shadows of the trees behind him. He stood tall and motionless, staring in our direction. There was something about the way he stood that felt wrong, unnatural. Not like a hunter or a hiker passing by. He wasn't moving, just watching. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to look away. My heart sped up, my mind racing with what to do. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I didn't wave. I just sat there, holding my friend's .357 revolver, something he always carried for safety when we camped in more remote areas. It felt heavy in my hands, a cold metal reminder of danger. The man stayed for what felt like a long time, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, just standing there at the edge of the clearing. Then, without a word or a sign, he turned and walked away. I watched his silhouette move slowly into the woods, disappearing behind the trees as quietly as he had come. That night, I stayed awake the whole time. I didn't sleep a single minute. I sat by the fire, clutching the revolver, watching the dark forest beyond the glow of the flames. The feeling of being watched never left. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of a branch made me jump. But I didn't hear or see the man again. When morning came, the forest was quiet except for the chirping of birds and the gentle rush of the river. Jason and I packed up the lean-to and headed back to the main camp, both of us silent, lost in thought. We told the others about the man, but they didn't seem too concerned. Maybe they thought it was a local hunter or someone passing through. But for me, the feeling of that night stuck. Over the next few days, I thought back on what I had seen and felt. The man's presence in the woods, watching us from the shadows, was unnerving. There were no signs of a campsite or tracks near where he stood. He hadn't come closer, hadn't tried to approach or speak. Yet his watching felt deliberate and heavy, like he was marking us in some way. The years since that night have done little to erase the memory. I've camped many times since, alone and with others, and I've learned to recognize the difference between the wild animals around me and something more human. I've come to understand mountain lions well enough to know that the fear I felt wasn't about them. Sometimes, when I'm out there, in the stillness of the forest under a full moon, I think about that man. I wonder who he was and what he was doing out there, watching two teenagers in the dark. I've never had a good answer. In the end, what I learned from that night wasn't just about the woods or the animals, but about being cautious and aware in the wild. It taught me that not all danger comes from nature. Sometimes the quietest threat can be a person, a stranger standing at the edge of your world, watching you in silence. That's why, even now, whenever I'm out camping alone, I keep my senses sharp and my hands close to something I can defend myself with. Because the forest is home, yes, but it can also hide things that don't belong, waiting quietly for their moment to reveal themselves. When I was around 14 or 15 years old, my family used to spend a lot of our summers camping at a state park about 3 hours from our home. It was the kind of place that felt like it hadn't changed in decades. Dense woods, a lake that always seemed cold no matter how hot the day got, and dirt roads with faded wooden signs pointing toward things like picnic area, camp store, or trail loop C. I couldn't tell you exactly where it was now, but I remember the smell of the pine and the dry crunch of gravel under car tires when we pulled in every summer like it was burned into my memory. We'd set up on the same site almost every year. My dad liked it because it was kind of tucked away at the far edge of the campground, close to a trailhead that led deeper into the forest. The trees there were tall and thick. The canopy blocked a lot of the light, so even during the day it always looked like late afternoon in the woods. I had a friend, Brandon, who usually came with us. He was only a few months older than me, but taller, leaner. We'd met in middle school, and we clicked because we were both the kind of kids who liked sneaking out of the tent late at night, not to cause trouble, but just to roam around in the dark and test our nerves. We called it the ritual. Every night after dinner, after the parents zipped themselves into their sleeping bags and the campground quieted down to a low hum of insects and distant crackling fires, Brandon and I would slip out of our tent with our flashlights. We'd take the trail behind our site and walk deeper into the woods. Sometimes we'd go a quarter mile in, sometimes half a mile. It depended on how brave we felt. The whole point of the ritual was to walk as far as we could with our flashlights off. We wanted to feel the dark pressing in, forcing us to rely on sound, memory, or our own nerve. We did it so often that we even learned to walk the paths with our eyes barely adjusted to the shadows. We liked to scare each other, too, breaking sticks on purpose or stopping suddenly just to mess with the other one. Dumb stuff like that. We thought we were brave. One night, it must have been late July because the air was thick and sticky even after dark. We decided to go further than we'd ever gone before. We started the walk as usual, whispering to each other at first, laughing about a kid at another site who got stung by a wasp during lunch, and then went quiet as we moved off the gravel path and into the forest trail. The deeper you went, the more the forest took over. The sound of people, music, kids, generators, faded out and got replaced by the sounds of the woods. Crickets, frogs, the occasional owl. Every once in a while, a gust of wind would move through the leaves and make them rustle like soft whispers. That was always the part where my stomach would knot just a little, but I never said anything. Neither did Brandon. We kept our flashlights off as long as we could, walking by feel, tracing the outline of the narrow dirt trail with the soles of our shoes. We stayed quiet, more out of habit than anything else, just soaking in the feeling of being totally alone in the woods. At some point, I remember looking over my shoulder. I couldn't see anything behind us except a wall of black trees. No light at all. It was the kind of dark that made you feel like you were underwater. We'd gone maybe half a mile from the last campsite when I heard something that didn't belong. It was a whisper. Not the wind kind, not the rustle of animals or leaves. This was an actual whisper, like a voice. I froze. I turned my head quick, expecting to see Brandon playing a trick on me, but I could see his silhouette standing still, just like me. He had heard it too. We clicked our flashlights on at the same time, beams cutting through the dark and bouncing off trees, leaves, branches. Nothing, just forest. We didn't say anything, we weren't talking anyway, but I could tell from the way Brandon adjusted his stance that he was uneasy. So was I. We started walking again, a little faster now. It wasn't panic yet, just that nervous energy you get when your brain starts suggesting things your body doesn't want to consider. But then it happened again. The whisper. This time it was louder. It didn't sound like a sentence. It wasn't even words that made sense. Just syllables, mumbles. But they were coming from behind us. We stopped again and turned around, flashlights scanning the woods. That's when we saw her. At first I thought it was a pile of clothes, just a dark lump on the ground in the middle of the trail. But then it moved, crawled. That's the only way I can describe it. Crawling low to the ground, like she didn't want to be seen. Her clothes were dark, maybe black or navy, and they blended into the dirt and pine needles. She was thin, with long hair that looked like it was caked in mud or leaves or both. Her hands scraped at the ground, slow and clumsy, and her mouth was moving constantly. Whispers, just random words. I couldn't make any of them out, not one. But her lips didn't stop. The light hit her full in the face for a second and she flinched, like a raccoon caught in a spotlight. She looked up at us with wide eyes, bloodshot and glassy. Then, slowly, she pushed herself up off the ground and stood. Her legs wobbled. She swayed like she might fall. Her clothes were filthy, smeared with dirt and pine needles. Her skin looked clammy in the light. She didn't charge at us. She didn't scream. She didn't say anything threatening. But the way she stood there, tilting back and forth, staring without blinking, it made my insides go cold. She didn't seem to care that we were just two teenage kids. She said something then, finally. Her voice was rough, like she hadn't spoken in a long time, and I remember she said she was looking for her campsite. That's when I started to feel less scared and more confused. Brandon gave me this quick look, like, what the hell is going on? We kept our flashlights on her and just stood there, not knowing what to do. It was clear something was off, way off, but she didn't seem dangerous, just messed up. We ended up walking her back, slowly. It took almost 20 minutes because she kept stopping and swaying and whispering weird things. She'd fall behind and we'd wait. She didn't seem to know where she was going, even though she kept saying she was looking for her group. When we finally got close enough to see the glow from the campfires again, she brightened up. Not like happy or relieved, but her movements got quicker. She mumbled louder. We led her back to the main gravel loop and found a site where some loud music was still playing. A group of people were sitting around, laughing, drinking, acting like nothing was wrong. We recognized one of the girls from earlier that day. She'd been playing frisbee near the lake. We pointed the woman toward them and waited. She walked over, stumbling slightly, and when they saw her, they just laughed. One of them helped her sit down, handed her a drink, and they just went back to whatever they were doing, like it was normal, like she hadn't been crawling around in the woods alone for who knows how long, whispering nonsense. Brandon and I didn't say anything. We just stood there for a minute, then walked back to our own site. We didn't talk on the way. It didn't feel like a story we wanted to joke about. It didn't even feel real, just heavy. When we got back, we crawled into the tent and zipped it shut. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time a branch snapped or a breeze moved the fabric of the tent, I thought of her. Alone in the woods, crawling like an animal, talking to nobody, covered in dirt. The next morning, we walked past that group again. She wasn't there. Maybe she was still asleep in one of the tents. Maybe she left. I don't know. But nobody looked concerned. Nobody even mentioned her. We never told our parents about it. We didn't stop doing the ritual either, but we never went that deep again. Not after that. From then on, we stayed within sight of the campground lights. It's been years since then. I still go camping sometimes. I still like the woods, but that night stuck with me in a way I can't fully explain. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was just a person, a real person so far gone from reality that she barely seemed human anymore. And the scariest part of it all wasn't her crawling around in the dirt. It was how little her friends seemed to care. If we hadn't walked that far, if we had decided to skip the ritual that night or just turned around earlier, I don't know how long she would have been out there. Maybe all night, maybe longer. I still wonder what would have happened if she wandered deeper instead of toward us. That night taught me something I didn't really understand at the time. Sometimes the scariest things out in the woods aren't wolves or monsters or ghosts. Sometimes it's just people. Lost, forgotten, or ignored. Slipping further away while nobody notices. And sometimes, if you're not paying attention, you might walk right past them. Or worse, you might not even hear the whispering until they're right behind you. Every summer when I was a kid, my family went camping. We didn't really do theme parks or long vacations like other families I knew. Instead, we had a big green van that my dad would pack up with coolers, folding chairs, sleeping bags, and tents. There'd be stacks of paper towels, packs of matches in a Ziploc bag, and enough bug spray to gas a neighborhood. It was just how we did things. Camping wasn't a question, it was a given. We rotated locations most years. Sometimes we'd end up in Virginia Beach, sometimes Westmoreland, and occasionally we went to Assateague Island. I always hated Westmoreland. It smelled like rotten leaves and wet rocks. The mosquitoes were big enough to carry you away, and every time we camped there, it either rained or everything we owned got covered in mud. Virginia Beach was more my speed, but it was usually crowded, and the noise from the other campsites kept me up at night. Assateague, though, that one had its own kind of strange energy. If you've never been there, it's this long, narrow island off the coast of Maryland and Virginia, known for its wild horses. They just roam the dunes and wander through the campsites like they own the place. There's something quiet and lonely about it. Not spooky exactly, just different. The story I'm about to tell happened at Assateague when I was about 10 or 11. Old enough to know when something felt wrong, but still young enough that I didn't always understand what I was looking at. That summer, we got there in early July. It was hot and muggy. The air felt like you had to chew through it just to breathe. Salt stuck to everything. My t-shirt was soaked with sweat within an hour of unpacking the van. The campground was crowded, mostly families, and the usual clatter of tent poles and cooler lids filled the air. Our site was near the dunes, just a few hundred feet from the beach. It wasn't right on the horse trail, at least that's what the ranger had told us. But in hindsight, I think we pitched too close. We had 2 tents. One was bigger, sort of a family tent, with enough space for 4 sleeping bags and our stuff. The other was smaller, meant for 2 people. That trip, my older brother and I took the small one and set it up a few yards away from the main tent, where my parents and little sister were staying. There were some shrubs and thin trees between us, but you could still see both tents from either one if you looked carefully. We spent most of that day at the beach. The sand was blistering hot, but the breeze off the ocean made it bearable. My brother tried to boogie board while I spent more time poking around in tide pools and trying to catch crabs with a plastic bucket. As the sun went down, we made a fire and roasted hot dogs. That was always my favorite part of these trips. The cooking, the crackling wood, the way everything felt quiet once the sun dipped below the dunes. I remember it got darker than I expected that night. The moon was up, but there were clouds racing across the sky. You could still see well enough once your eyes adjusted, but there was this patchy quality to the light. It would be bright for a moment, then dull, then bright again when the clouds thinned out. The wind picked up, and we had to throw some rocks into the tent corners to keep the flaps from smacking around. I zipped into my sleeping bag, not really tired, but I pretended to be so my brother wouldn't bug me. I laid there for a long time just listening. Every little sound was sharper at night. Twigs snapping, the flapping of nylon, rustling leaves. The ocean waves were a steady thud in the background, like a heartbeat for the island. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was opening my eyes to the sound of a zipper. Not ours. It wasn't the quick zip you make when you're just getting out of your tent to pee. It was slow, almost careful. Then it stopped. I froze. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The air felt colder, and my skin was clammy with sweat that had dried into a chill. I could hear the waves still and the flap of the tarp outside, but something else too. Breathing. Not heavy breathing or anything loud. Just this soft, steady sound, like someone trying to be quiet. I turned my head slowly toward the side of the tent that faced the main one. My brother was asleep, dead to the world. his face mashed against his pillow and his back rising and falling. But I could see something outside. A shadow, a shape. It was standing just outside the thin wall of the tent, where the moonlight hit the fabric in a kind of pale glow. I blinked, trying to focus. It looked like a person. Thin, tall, with what looked like long, messy hair falling over its shoulders. My brain didn't know what to make of it. It looked like an old woman, hunched slightly, her head tilted toward the tent. I couldn't see her face, just the outline of her figure through the tent wall. She wasn't moving. My heart was thumping hard now, and I felt my stomach flip. I wanted to wake up my brother, but I didn't dare move. Every scary story I'd ever heard came rushing into my head at once. It didn't make sense. Why would someone be standing outside our tent in the middle of the night? The campground wasn't known for weirdos or crime. It was families, mostly. But still, she just stood there. I must have stayed frozen for what felt like minutes. I started thinking I was imagining it, that it was just the shape of a tree or the flap of the tent bent weird in the wind. But then it moved. The head shifted slightly to the side, and the hair swayed. It was real. Whoever or whatever it was looking right at us. That's when I realized there was more than one shadow. Another moved behind it, closer to the edge of the tent. They weren't people. I couldn't breathe for a second, couldn't wrap my head around it. The main shape, what I thought was an old woman, stepped forward again, and the moonlight hit just right for a moment. What I saw wasn't a person. It was a horse, not like the horses you see in movies or on farms. This one looked like it had been dragged through a swamp. Long, scraggly hair hung down from its neck, and its head was low, its nostrils flared. It was staring into the tent, not moving, barely blinking. From that angle, with the light and the weird way its mane fell, it had looked like a person, an old woman hunched over. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Still, it didn't make me feel better. There were more of them now. I could hear the snorting and the hoof steps on the soft ground. I unzipped the tent flap just a crack and peeked out. They were everywhere. At least 5 of them, maybe more, standing silently in the open space between our tents. One of them was nudging the cooler with its nose. Another stepped over the campfire ring. They were thin, their ribs visible even in the low light. Their manes were tangled with bits of seaweed and sand. It hit me then. We had pitched the tent right on their trail to the beach. I backed away from the flap and zipped it shut slowly. My brother was still out cold. I just laid there, listening to the horses shuffle and snort. At one point, I heard one of them stumble into the folding chairs. Something metal clanged, and a second later the sound of hooves thundering off into the distance shook the ground. I thought they were all gone, but then I heard breathing again, right outside the tent. It was the same one as before, the one that had stared into the tent. It hadn't moved. I sat up slowly, heart hammering in my chest, and stared at the tent wall. The shape was still there, still watching. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, the shadows vanished. My brother finally stirred and yawned. I didn't say anything right away. I just opened the tent and stepped out into the early morning haze. The ground outside was covered in hoof prints, deep ones. They led down the trail toward the beach, pressed into the damp sand like scars. One of the folding chairs was on its side, and the cooler had been nudged several feet away from where we left it. My mom was already up. She was sitting at the picnic table, holding a cup of coffee, staring off in the direction of the dunes. I looked at her, and something in her face told me she'd seen it too. Later that morning, we moved the small tent closer to the main one and farther from the trail. That was the last time we camped at Assateague. My parents said it was too crowded, too much hassle with the horses, but I think that night changed something for them too. There was something in the way that horse watched us, not just out of curiosity, but with something colder, deeper. I'll never forget how human it looked in the dark, how close it got, how long it stood there like it was trying to remember us. Camping never really felt the same after that. I still go sometimes, but I triple check where I pitch my tent, and I never ever camp near animal trails again. And when the wind picks up and the night gets quiet, I always remember that face. That long hair, those dark eyes, and the way it didn't blink. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was real, and that's what made it worse. I've always liked camping alone. Some people don't get it. They say it's lonely or boring or even dangerous. But for me, it's the one time I can really breathe.
No schedules.
No traffic. No noise except for what nature makes. I've done solo trips through dense pine forests, through high deserts, along the coast, even snow camped once when I didn't really plan to. Most of the time, it's uneventful, peaceful, the kind of quiet that resets your head. This trip started like all the others. It was early fall, maybe mid-September. The nights were getting colder, the bugs were gone, and the forest was just starting to change. Reds and oranges bleeding into the green. I had a couple of days off work, and I just wanted to unplug. I'd found this trail online. It cut down into a shallow valley near a river, far enough off the highway that it wasn't on the radar for tourists or weekenders, but not so remote that it felt like a survival expedition. I parked my truck at the trailhead and threw on my pack. It was a bit later in the day than I'd planned. I'd stopped to get a burger on the way and lost an hour just sitting in the truck eating and listening to a dumb podcast. But I wasn't worried. I figured I could hike in a couple miles, find a flat spot near the river, get a fire going, and crash early. About 2 miles in, the sun had dropped just enough that everything started taking on that orange glow. You know the one. The light filters through the trees sideways. Long shadows stretch over the ground, and everything gets still. I rounded a bend in the trail and saw a guy sitting on a stump, just there like he'd been waiting. I didn't jump or panic. He looked harmless, mid-40s maybe, lean but not skinny, short beard, flannel shirt. Nothing about him screamed danger. He gave a little wave and I nodded. He asked if I was looking for a spot to camp. I said yeah, just trying to get close to the river before it got dark. He pointed off-trail behind him. "There's a spot right over there," he said. "Locals use it. Not on the maps, but it's flat and close to water. Safe, quiet, kind of hidden too." Now, I've done this long enough to know better than to trust random strangers in the woods. But something about the way he said it didn't throw me. He wasn't pushy. He didn't offer to walk me there. Just pointed and went back to sipping on something in a camp mug. I told him thanks and followed the line he pointed at. About 200 yards off trail, the trees thinned out and the ground opened into a small clearing tucked behind a natural berm. I could hear the river maybe 50 feet beyond a row of shrubs. It really was a perfect spot, and like he said, hidden. If someone was walking the trail or even driving the gravel road above the valley, they wouldn't see a thing. I liked that. It was already getting dark, so I didn't bother setting up the tent. I had a topper on my truck bed that I'd lined with a thin sleeping mat and some cheap battery lights. It wasn't luxury, but it was better than dealing with tent poles and stakes in the dark. I got a little fire going, pulled out a couple of beers, and threw on my earbuds. Listened to a comedy podcast my buddy had recommended while watching the flames. It was one of those nights where everything felt locked in. The beer was cold. The jokes were dumb. The fire crackled just enough. I wasn't worried about anything. I figured I'd cook something simple in the morning, hike back out by noon, maybe hit a diner on the drive home. I finished off a second beer, tossed a few more branches into the fire, and climbed into the truck. The river made just enough noise to drown out most of the forest sounds. But now and then, I'd hear a branch snap or the rustle of leaves. Nothing out of place. I fell asleep easy, but I did wake up once, maybe around 2 or 3 a.m. I wasn't startled or sweating or anything, just that weird half-sleep where your brain perks up for no reason. It was dead quiet, not creepy quiet, just still. No wind, no water sounds, no night animals. I lay there for a while, eyes half open, just listening. I thought maybe it was just a momentary lull. Sometimes nature just pauses. I didn't see or hear anything. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, I woke to the soft blue light of early dawn. You know, the type where the sun isn't up but everything's visible, and there's that cold dew on your windshield. I climbed out of the truck, stretched, scratched my neck, and started putting together a small fire to make coffee and eggs. That's when I saw him, at the edge of the clearing, just standing there, He wasn't facing me. His back was to me, but he was close enough that I could see the shape of him clearly. Long, messy hair, dirty jacket, torn jeans, and these bags. Dozens of plastic grocery bags tied to his arms, his belt hanging from his shoulders. They rustled quietly when he shifted. I froze, just stared. He wasn't moving toward me. He wasn't looking at me. He just sort of paced in a lazy, weird circle near the edge of the trees. Every few seconds he'd stop, shuffle a bit, then move again, never fully facing me. I figured maybe he was homeless, or mentally ill, or high, or all of the above. I tried to act normal, picked up a stick, poked at the fire, cracked open a beer even though it wasn't even 7 a.m. I figured if I acted casual, maybe it'd calm the tension. I said something dumb like, "Nice morning." Nothing.
No flinch.
No look. He didn't say a word, just kept circling, almost like he was trying to decide something. I offered him some food. Nothing. Offered a beer. Still nothing. Now, I know how this sounds, but there was something in my gut telling me this wasn't just some drifter or hiker. This guy didn't wander into my camp by accident. He'd been watching, maybe even since last night. Maybe he'd seen the fire or heard the podcast through my earbuds. Hell, maybe he'd watched me sleep in the truck all night. That thought hit hard. If I'd set up the tent like I'd planned, he could have walked right up, slid it open, or worse. I was thankful for the solid frame of the truck. I kept my buck knife clipped to my belt and the bear spray next to the fire pit. I shifted slowly so I was closer to both, still pretending to be casual, but inside I was on full alert. After a few more minutes of him circling, not speaking, not looking at me, just existing there in this bizarre, threatening way, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, grabbed the bear spray, held it low but ready. I didn't ask him nicely. I didn't try to sound tough. I just said loud and clear that he needed to leave. Now, he didn't move at first, just kind of paused. Then, like some switch flipped, he turned slowly, not toward me, but away, and started walking off through the trees. Bags rustling. No words, no reaction, just gone. I watched until I couldn't see him anymore. Then I waited another 5 minutes. I didn't hear anything, didn't see the brush move, didn't feel like I was being watched, but I didn't trust any of it. I threw everything into the truck, didn't bother cleaning up the fire pit, didn't double-check the cooler or the gear. I just packed it all, slammed the tailgate, and got behind the wheel. I drove straight out, tires kicking up gravel. Didn't stop until I hit pavement again. Didn't breathe easy until I hit cell service and started seeing houses again. Looking back, I keep thinking about one thing. He never looked at me, not once. That still messes with me. It was like I didn't exist, or like he didn't want me to know he'd already seen enough. I wonder how long he was watching me. From the trees, maybe from across the river, maybe from just behind the berm I thought was protecting me. I keep thinking about how vulnerable I really was, laughing out loud to a podcast, drinking, firelight lighting me up like a beacon, totally unaware, totally open. That clearing was too perfect, too hidden, too off-trail. It makes me wonder if I was the only one who ever used it, or if that guy had been using it too, or living there, or waiting for someone just like me. I don't camp off-trail anymore, not solo. And I always trust my gut now, because out there, in the deep quiet of the woods, you're not alone just because someone shows up. You might have been watched the whole damn time. I've been camping plenty of times, with friends, alone, with my siblings, even with my parents when we were younger. Most of those trips blurred together, just quiet evenings, fires crackling, bugs chirping, and the occasional raccoon rustling around. But there's one trip I'll never forget. One that burned itself into my memory like a scar. Not because of some creature in the woods or some ghost story come to life, but because of nature itself, raw, loud, and unforgiving. That trip made me respect the outdoors in a way I hadn't before. It was a late summer trip, early August. My older brother Kyle, my younger sister Sam, and I decided we needed one last outing before the season turned. We picked a familiar campground by a large lake, maybe a 2-hour drive from the city. The place wasn't fancy. No cabins, no electricity, just a few scattered plots with picnic tables, a handful of fire rings, and 2 outhouses that always smelled like death. But it had a wide view of the lake, dense woods for shade, and at night the stars came out like they had something to prove. We packed up in Kyle's old SUV. He was the only one with a car big enough to carry all our gear and the 3 of us. Sam brought snacks and books, I handled the tent and supplies, and Kyle made sure we had enough firewood and gas to get there and back. The forecast had been clear when we left. Maybe a chance of light rain on Sunday, but nothing more. I remember checking twice the morning we left. It felt important for some reason. I wish I'd paid more attention. The drive was uneventful, the kind where music hums low, windows are half down, and you just let the road stretch ahead without thinking. We got to the campsite mid-afternoon. It wasn't too busy. A few RVs had parked deeper in, and a couple of families had set up near the wooded edge, but we claimed a nice open spot near the water. We liked to be able to see the lake. The sun reflected off it like melted silver, and dragonflies danced near the surface. Setting up was easy. We'd done it enough times. The tent was a big one. Technically a 4-person dome tent, though we always called it the 6 Sardines tent, since we had to lay shoulder to shoulder to make it work. But we didn't care. It was about being outside, not comfort. We got the fire pit ready, unpacked the cooler, laid out the sleeping bags inside the tent, and even dragged a few large rocks to use as makeshift chairs. That first evening was perfect. The wind was calm. The lake was still. We grilled hot dogs, told stories, and let the sun sink into the trees while the fire cast shadows across our faces. The air smelled like pine and smoke, and for a few hours, everything was quiet and good. Around 10, we called it a night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the night sounds had taken over. Owls in the distance, leaves rustling gently, the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface of the water. I fell asleep fast. I remember staring up through the mesh top of the tent, watching the stars, and then drifting off. But that peace didn't last. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just wind, but it was too low. A kind of humming, deep and constant, like an engine far off. I sat up. Sam was still out cold. Kyle too. I unzipped the flap just a bit and peeked outside. The trees were moving more than they had before. Their tops were swaying. Then I noticed the air had changed, thicker, heavier, like the pressure had dropped. I knew storms could come fast in this part of the state, but this felt different. Felt wrong. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. 1 bar earlier in the day, but now nothing. Still, the sky didn't look too bad, cloudy. Sure, but not violent. I zipped the flap back up and lay down, but I didn't fall asleep. Something kept me alert, like my body knew before my mind caught up. Then the first lightning strike hit. It didn't flash above, it hit the lake. I didn't even process the sound at first. Just the blinding light and the crack, like the sky being torn in half. That one bolt lit everything. I saw the whole lake flash white, trees backlit like paper cutouts, the tent glowing briefly like a lantern. Then came the thunder, instant and massive.
No delay.
No space. That meant it was close. Dangerously close. Kyle bolted upright. Sam sat up groggily. Then came the wind. I swear I've never heard anything like it. It didn't build up slowly, it slammed into us. 1 second there was a breeze. The next the tent walls bent inward like fists were punching them. Our gear started rolling. The cooler tipped over. One of the poles snapped with a sharp crack. I held on to the center brace with both hands as the tent lifted slightly, then dropped again. Another lightning bolt slammed into the lake. This one closer, then another. The thunder didn't stop anymore. It rolled into itself, deep and constant. The sky looked alive, like electricity was crawling through the clouds in all directions. We yelled at each other over the noise, though I don't remember what was said. Just panic. I could feel the ground shaking under me. I knew we couldn't stay in the tent. It wasn't going to hold. The walls were buckling. The wind had taken the rain fly and water started pouring in. Something hit the side hard, maybe a branch, maybe something else. We grabbed what we could: phones, flashlights, shoes, not even coats. We didn't have time. The three of us burst out of the tent and ran full tilt to the car, about 30 feet away. The rain hit like needles, cold and sideways. I could barely see. The car rocked on its suspension as we climbed in, all soaked and shivering. I slammed the door and locked it out of habit, even though that was pointless. Through the windshield, we watched the tent collapse in real time. One pole snapped in half. Then the whole thing folded inward, lifted a few feet, and slammed into the ground. The wind rolled it like a tumbleweed, and it flew into a nearby pine, wrapping around it like a plastic bag. Inside the car, we sat, breathing hard, listening to the roar outside. The rain beat the roof like hail, and every bolt of lightning lit the whole area like daylight. The thunder didn't stop. It felt like we were inside it. The entire car shook, not just from the wind, but from the sound. At some point, Kyle started the engine. The radio didn't work, just static. GPS was gone. But we all agreed without words we couldn't stay. We had to get out. He backed up slowly, dodging branches already littering the ground. The headlights showed leaves swirling in the air, sticks flying like arrows. I saw another tent in the distance collapsed, a family's belongings strewn all over the dirt. We drove. The road out twisted through the woods for about a mile before it met the main road. That drive felt like it took an hour, but it was probably only a few minutes. Trees leaned in from both sides. The rain made it hard to see more than 10 feet ahead. The tires skidded on the mud. Once, we had to stop completely as a huge branch fell just ahead of us. Kyle drove over it slowly, the car bumping up and down. Finally, we hit the highway and turned toward town. Grandpa's house was 20 minutes away. He lived alone on the edge of the next county. We didn't call, we couldn't, but we knew he'd open the door no matter what hour it was. When we pulled into his driveway, the storm hadn't reached there yet. The skies were black, sure, but the wind was still and the rain hadn't started. We pounded on the door. He let us in, took one look at us, and got us towels and dry clothes. We explained what had happened while shaking from cold and adrenaline. He didn't say much, just gave us blankets and told us to sleep. Couldn't. I lay there, wide awake, listening as the storm rolled in about an hour later. It wasn't as strong by then, just heavy rain and wind. But I couldn't stop thinking about the tent flying, the lightning slamming the lake, the sound of the car shaking like it might flip. The next morning, once it passed, we went back. The campground looked like a war zone. Part of it was roped off. A ranger in a bright vest waved us down and told us some areas were closed due to fallen trees. Power lines were down on one edge, and half the gravel road was blocked. We showed him where our site was, and he let us through, though warned us to be careful. Our spot was barely recognizable. Branches were everywhere. The tree our tent had hit was scorched on one side. Some of our gear was still there. Sam's shoes were in the mud. My sleeping bag was gone. Just gone. I never saw it again. We picked through the wreckage slowly, silently, gathered what we could. Some things were salvageable. Most weren't. Other campers were doing the same, walking through the debris, inspecting the damage. One guy said the ranger told him a small tornado had touched down nearby, though nobody was sure when exactly. Could have been during the worst part of the storm or just after. Either way, it had been close. Real close. We finished cleaning up, packed the car, and left. None of us spoke much on the way home. The silence wasn't awkward. It was just the weight of what we'd been through. It hadn't felt like camping. It had felt like I've never been the type to scare easily. I grew up in a small town near the mountains and spent a lot of time outdoors. Camping, hiking, and just being out in the woods felt normal to me. I always thought I could handle whatever nature threw my way. That confidence, or maybe stubbornness, was probably what made what happened to me even worse. I want to tell you the whole story because I know some people might think it sounds like a ghost story or some kind of made-up horror tale. But I swear it's real, and it's about how real people can be just as frightening as any ghost or monster. It started with a simple plan, a weekend away in a cabin. Not some fancy place with running water and electricity, but a small, basic cabin deep in the mountains, the kind you rent out for a couple days to get away from the city noise. I found the listing online, saw some pictures, and figured it'd be a good way to relax after a long stretch of work. The cabin was called Dead Man's Ridge Cabin. Yeah, the name should have been a warning in itself, but I didn't think much of it. Names like that are common in the mountains. They're just to attract tourists or add a little thrill. The owner was a man named Carl, who lived in the nearby town and handled rentals. We exchanged a few messages, and he told me the cabin was clean, had a wood stove, and was stocked with basic supplies like firewood and some canned goods left by the previous renter. I packed my bag with clothes, food, some hiking gear, and enough fire-starting tools to last the weekend. I didn't plan to bring anyone else with me. I needed to get away from people for a bit, clear my head. The drive up was long but peaceful. The road narrowed as I got closer to the mountain, twisting and turning through thick forests. Around late afternoon, I reached the small dirt road Carl had told me about. It was easy enough to miss if you didn't pay attention. I drove down it for a few miles until the forest seemed to close in all around me. The air was cooler, filled with the smell of pine and damp earth. Finally, the cabin came into view. It looked even smaller in person than in the pictures, but sturdy. Weathered wood, a small porch with a couple of old chairs, a stone chimney sticking out the roof. No electricity, no cell signal. That last part was fine by me. I wanted to disconnect anyway. I parked my car next to the cabin, grabbed my gear, and walked up the porch steps. The door was unlocked, just like Carl said. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table, a few chairs, and a narrow bed pushed into the corner. The floor creaked under my feet. Dust was light but visible. The place smelled like old wood and dampness. I lit a fire in the stove, and the cabin slowly warmed up. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the trees outside. I unpacked my food, made a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, and ate while sitting at the table, watching the fire through the small window. The woods outside were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant bird calls. I thought I'd take a quick walk before dark to stretch my legs and get a feel for the place. I stepped outside, locking the door behind me, and followed a narrow path that led downhill toward a small clearing. I could hear a creek somewhere nearby, its soft rush blending with the wind. The sky darkened quickly, and I turned back toward the cabin, noticing that the forest seemed much denser here, with tall trees blocking most of the remaining light. Back inside, I stoked the fire to keep the cabin warm and settled onto the bed with a book. The wind started to pick up, shaking the cabin just enough to make the wood groan. Outside, branches scraped against the windows, and the occasional snap of twigs sounded like footsteps. I tried to focus on the book, but my mind kept drifting to the noises. I reminded myself that I was in the middle of the woods, and noises like that were normal. Animals, the wind, maybe a raccoon or two. Nothing to be afraid of. Still, the noises didn't stop. Around midnight, I heard something different. Not the wind or animals, but a slow, steady crunching sound outside the cabin, like someone walking carefully on the gravel path. I froze, listening. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, moving closer to the cabin. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a wild pig, but the crunching was too heavy for a deer, too careful for a pig. I grabbed my flashlight from the table and opened the door slowly. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I closed the door and locked it tight. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was just nerves. Morning came slowly, with a pale light filtering through the trees. I was tired but determined to enjoy the day. I made breakfast on the stove, then decided to explore the area more. I took the path toward the creek, following it upstream. The forest opened up here and there, showing steep cliffs and rocks covered with moss. I found a small waterfall where the water spilled over a ledge, cold and clear. I filled my water bottle and sat for a while, listening to the water and watching the sunlight dance on the surface. On my way back, I noticed something odd near the trail. Fresh footprints, too large for any deer and clearly human. They weren't deep, so whoever had been there was careful. But the prints stopped abruptly near a cluster of bushes. I felt uneasy but didn't think much of it. Maybe another hiker or hunter had passed through. The second night was colder. The fire burned low in the stove, and the wind outside was louder, like a low howl through the trees. I was about to go to bed when I heard it again, the crunching footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. This time I wasn't alone. I had my old hunting knife next to me, and I wasn't about to let my guard down. I sat quietly, listening as the footsteps circled the cabin 2 or 3 times, stopping for a minute in front of the door before moving away. The sounds faded into the night, but sleep was impossible after that. At first light, I checked the area around the cabin. There were new footprints in the dirt, coming from the woods and stopping right at the porch steps. I looked for any signs of disturbance, scratches on the door, moved rocks, anything. Nothing. Whoever had been here was careful. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I wasn't alone, and whoever had been watching me was close. I packed my things quickly. I decided to leave as soon as possible. But as I got into my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the back of my windshield, scratched into the glass with something sharp, was a message. Just 2 words, "Get out." I didn't think twice. I started the car and drove as fast as the road would allow, the trees blurring past. My heart was racing, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I got back to town, I reported the message to the local sheriff's office. They took it seriously, though there wasn't much they could do without any proof of who might have been near the cabin. Carl, the cabin owner, said no one else had been renting it recently and that he'd checked the place himself. At the cabin, we found the door had fresh scratch marks and the porch floorboards were shifted, like someone had tried to force their way in. Nearby in the woods, we spotted clear signs that someone had camped out very close to the cabin. Makeshift fire pit, discarded food wrappers, and a tarp tied between 2 trees. It was clear whoever had been there had been watching the cabin, maybe waiting for someone to come or go. I never stayed at the cabin again. I learned later that the area had a reputation not for ghosts, but for some dangerous people, poachers, squatters, or just drifters who like to live off the grid. I think someone saw me as a threat or just wanted to scare me off. Whatever their reason, I never found out who it was. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had stayed. I'm not sure I'd be here to tell the story. The woods can be beautiful, but they can also hide real dangers. Not from monsters or spirits, but from other people. When you're alone in a place where no one can hear you, even the smallest sign of someone else can feel like a threat. I learned that day to trust my instincts and to respect how unpredictable nature and people can be. No ghosts, no fairy tales. Just the raw, uncomfortable truth that sometimes the scariest things are real and very close to home. I never thought I'd be someone who got scared staying alone in a cabin. I'm a city guy, used to noise, crowds, the constant hum of life. But a few years ago, I needed to get away from everything. Work, stress, people, screens. I wanted silence. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the forest, a few hours' drive from the city. It was isolated, barely reachable by road. No cell signal, no internet. Perfect. The cabin was old, made of weathered logs, with a small porch and a stone chimney. It sat beside a narrow dirt road that disappeared into the woods. The area was dense with pine and oak trees, thick underbrush, and a nearby stream that trickled quietly. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine needles and damp earth. I was alone, and it was exactly what I wanted. I arrived just before dusk, lugging my bags from the car. The gravel driveway was rough, and the last few hundred yards were rutted and uneven. The place looked deserted. No other houses, no lights, just the cabin staring back at me in the fading light. I unlocked the door with the key I'd been given, stepped inside, and was hit by the smell of old wood and musty blankets. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A single room with a rough wooden table and chairs. A small stove in the corner. a sink with a hand pump, and a bed pushed against the far wall. A woodpile sat neatly stacked by the door. There was no electricity, just a couple of oil lamps on the shelves and a box of matches on the table. I put my bags down, started unpacking, and lit a lamp. The room glowed softly. Outside, the last light was disappearing fast. The woods were growing dark, and the wind began to pick up, rustling the leaves against the cabin walls. I went out to the porch and stood for a while, listening to the sounds. The creak of branches, the faint hum of insects, the distant call of a bird.
No cars, no planes, no voices.
Just me and the forest. That first night was quiet, though I didn't sleep well. The unfamiliar sounds, wood cracking, small animals moving around, kept waking me up. I lay in the bed, eyes wide, staring at the ceiling as the wind howled outside. The cabin felt sturdy, but every small noise made my heart jump. I told myself it was just the forest, nothing more. In the morning, I made coffee on the stove, boiled water from the stream, and took a long walk down a trail that started just beyond the cabin. The trees towered overhead, filtering the sunlight into green shadows. The path was narrow, uneven, and after a while, I found myself farther from the cabin than I wanted. The silence out here was deep, almost heavy, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. I tried to keep track of landmarks to find my way back. The stream, a large fallen tree, a strange rock shaped like a jagged triangle. After about an hour, I felt ready to turn back. I walked quickly, but when I reached the spot where the trail should have been, it was gone, covered by fallen branches and brush. For a moment, panic prickled my skin. I looked around carefully, but everything seemed the same. The woods all looked alike. I retraced my steps slowly, trying to keep calm. After about 20 minutes, I finally spotted the trail again, faint under the leaves. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept my eyes scanning, but there was nothing, just trees. The next day, I went into the nearby small town to pick up some supplies. It was a quiet place with a general store, a gas station, and a few houses scattered along the main road. I stocked up on canned food, batteries, and some firewood. The cashier was polite but didn't say much, and the locals seemed friendly but reserved. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon chopping wood and stacking it by the porch. The rhythm of the work helped me settle in, made me forget the creeping unease from the day before. That night, I built a fire in the stone ring outside and sat watching the flames flicker. The stars were bright, scattered across the black sky like tiny lanterns. I felt peaceful for a while. Then the noises started. First, it was just little things. Branches snapping near the cabin at odd times. The sound of footsteps crunching on dead leaves just beyond the tree line. Sometimes the wind would blow strangely, making the trees groan like old bones. One night, I was lying in bed, the fire outside dying down, when I heard something slow, deliberate moving outside. Not running, not frantic, but steady. I froze. The sound circled the cabin, slow and steady, moving closer, then farther away. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight from the table, shining the beam out the window. The woods were black beyond the reach of the light. No movement, no shape, just shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. The forest was full of animals, but my chest tightened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The following days were tense. Each night, the sounds came closer and stayed longer. Footsteps, rustling leaves. Once, I found the firewood pile disturbed. Some logs moved, small footprints in the soft dirt around the porch. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but nothing matched. No claw marks, no fur, nothing. The cabin door was locked every night, but I started double-checking it, sliding a chair against it for extra security. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. One morning, I woke early, stepped outside to gather water from the stream, and noticed strange markings on the trees near the cabin. Deep scratches, too wide for any animal I knew, rough and jagged like someone had clawed at the bark with something sharp. I ran my hand over the marks, feeling the rough edges. The hair on my neck stood up. I tried to keep busy, to stay rational. I read from a worn book I'd brought, fixed the leaking tap, cleaned the small kitchen area, but the feeling of being watched never left me. At night, the sounds came again, closer, more deliberate. One night, after a long day of trying to distract myself, I heard a noise outside the window. Sharp, quick. I froze. I peeked through the curtains and saw nothing. Then a shadow moved, just beyond the trees. Something tall, moving slowly. I swallowed hard and stepped back from the window. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the cabin walls. I lit all the lamps I had, even though it was early, wanting to keep the light around me. The silence returned, but I didn't sleep. The fourth night was the worst. I woke suddenly, cold sweat on my forehead, heart pounding. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers of the fire outside. I heard footsteps, clear, heavy, deliberate around the perimeter of the cabin. Not fast, but steady, slow, circling. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly stepped to the door. The cold metal of the handle pressed into my palm as I unlocked it and cracked it open. The air outside was cold and still, but the footsteps had stopped. The night was silent except for the distant call of an owl. I stepped outside slowly, flashlight sweeping the trees. Nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. I shut the door and bolted it, leaning against it for a long moment. My breath came in shallow gasps. Then, through the woods, I heard a low, deep growl. Not an animal I recognized. It was guttural, close, just beyond the tree line. I froze, flashlight shaking in my hand. Morning came slowly, and with it, daylight brought a fragile sense of safety. I didn't sleep much. I packed my things hurriedly, heart pounding every time a branch cracked or a bird called. I needed to leave. I went to start the car, but it wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. No cell service, no way to call for help. I cursed myself for not checking it earlier. I had to walk. I grabbed my backpack and started down the dirt road, hoping to find a main road or a house. The sun was high, but the forest was thick and shadowy. Every step felt heavier. Hours passed. The trail twisted and turned, and I began to lose my sense of direction. The trees looked the same in every direction. I stopped several times to catch my breath, listen for sounds, but the forest was quiet, too quiet. Suddenly, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, but saw only trees. I kept walking, faster now, heart pounding, sweat slicking my skin. The shadows between the trees seemed to stretch and move, though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks. I stumbled onto a small dirt road, wider and clearer than the trail I'd been following. Relief flooded me. I kept walking along it, hoping for a house or a passing car. I tried to stay calm, focused on putting one foot in front of the other. After what felt like forever, I saw a car parked beside a small cabin. Smoke rose gently from the chimney. A figure appeared on the porch, and I waved frantically. They saw me and came down the steps. That person gave me a ride to the nearest town, where I called for help to jumpstart my car. On the way back, I looked out at the trees. It was late October when I decided to spend a few days alone at the cabin my uncle left me in the mountains. I hadn't been there in years. Actually, the last time I went was when I was a kid. My uncle passed away recently, and I wanted to take a break from the city, clear my head, and maybe start sorting through some things. The cabin was old, wooden, and stood alone near the top of a ridge called Pine Ridge. The closest neighbor was at least a mile down the dirt road, and the nearest town was a good 20 miles away. I arrived just as the sun was dipping behind the tall pines. The sky was that dull orange-gray color that happens in fall, and the air was sharp and cold. I parked my car on the gravel driveway, which was covered in scattered dry leaves. The cabin was as I remembered. Weathered dark wood, a stone chimney, a porch that sagged slightly in the middle, and windows dusty and clouded from months of neglect. A wooden rocking chair sat on the porch, empty, creaking slightly in the chilly breeze. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine, dust, and a faint trace of smoke. It was simple, A small living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a rusty stove, a single bathroom with a cracked sink, and 2 small bedrooms. The furniture was all old, mismatched, but sturdy. The place hadn't been lived in for months, maybe longer. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the floorboards creaked under my boots. I unpacked a small bag, lighting a few candles because the electric line barely worked and the main fuse box was a mess. I wanted to get the fireplace going, so I gathered some dry wood from the small shed out back. The wind was picking up, making the pines outside sway and whisper with every gust. By the time I had the fire roaring, it was nearly dark. I ate a simple meal of canned soup and bread, sitting near the fire, watching the flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. I felt a strange mix of peace and unease, as if the quiet was too thick, as if the woods were holding their breath. That first night, I slept lightly, waking often to strange noises. Branches tapping on the roof, the wind howling through the cracks in the windows. Sometimes, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside, soft and distant. But when I looked, there was nothing but darkness and the silhouette of trees. The next day, I tried to keep busy. I walked down the dirt road to check the mailbox by the gate and saw the remains of an old campfire nearby. Someone had been here recently, or maybe a hunter or traveler. The woods felt denser during the day. The trees stood tall, bare of leaves now, their branches reaching like crooked fingers toward the gray sky. I gathered more firewood, swept the floors, and started cleaning the cabin. I found a few old notebooks and papers in a drawer. My uncle had been a man who liked to jot down his thoughts. Some pages mentioned strange things happening around the ridge. Footprints found near the cabin, odd sounds in the forest at night, things moved or missing from his supplies. Nothing supernatural, just unexplained signs of someone else being around. Maybe trespassers or hunters. I shrugged it off. I liked the solitude. I liked the quiet, but the feeling never left me. That something was watching, waiting. That evening, as I sat by the fire again, I noticed the wind had stopped. The air was unnaturally still, heavy, like before a storm. I looked outside and saw something move behind the trees. A dark shape, just for a second. Maybe a deer, maybe something else. I felt my skin prickling. I decided to lock all the doors and windows. The old cabin had a rusty bolt lock on the front door and wooden shutters on the windows. I slid the bolts into place, stacked a few chairs against the door just to be safe. The sense of being alone here was no longer comforting. It felt like being a small island surrounded by an ocean of silence and darkness. Around midnight, the quiet shattered. A sharp sound, like a heavy branch breaking, came from outside. Then another snap, closer this time, like someone was walking around the cabin. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully opened the door a crack, peering out into the blackness. I couldn't see anything. The beam of my light caught nothing but the outlines of trees and the dark shape of the shed. I stayed there for a moment, listening, trying to hear if anything moved. Suddenly, I heard a low, slow scraping noise against the side of the cabin, like someone dragging something heavy, maybe a bag or a piece of equipment. My hands trembled. I shut the door and locked it tighter, backing away slowly. I stayed up most of the night, sitting by the fire with an old hunting knife I found in a drawer. The scratching and scraping continued intermittently. Sometimes, faint footsteps circled the cabin, slow and careful. Sometimes the silence returned, thicker than before. Morning was a relief. The sun's weak light filtered through the windows. The cold air felt less oppressive. But outside, I saw footprints. A few sets, boot prints in the soft earth just beyond the porch. They didn't belong to any animal. They were human. I couldn't tell if they were recent or from the day before, but they circled the cabin twice, coming close to the windows, the back door, and the shed. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. I stayed inside most of the day, refusing to explore far. I called the nearest town on my phone, hoping to get some help, but the signal was weak and dropped. The area was known to have poor coverage, so I couldn't even reliably call for help. At dusk, I decided to lock up tight again. But as I was closing the back door, I noticed the latch was bent, almost forced open. I hadn't seen it like that in the daylight. My stomach twisted. That night was worse. The noises came again, louder, more persistent. Scratching, scraping, footsteps. At one point, I heard something heavier hit the side of the cabin, like a rock or a heavy branch thrown against the wall. I felt completely trapped. The only way out was the dirt road down the ridge, and whoever was outside knew that. I considered hiking down at first light, but I was afraid. Afraid of being caught outside. Afraid of what I might find. The next morning, I found more signs someone had been around overnight. The firewood I gathered the day before was scattered. Some of my supplies were missing from the porch table. A lighter, a small knife, a bottle of water. I realized whoever was out there had been watching me, maybe waiting for me to get careless. I made a plan. I gathered as many things as I could to block the doors and windows. Furniture, firewood, anything heavy. I took a large metal camping pot and filled it with water, setting it near the door as a makeshift alarm. If someone tried to open the door, it would topple and make noise. I spent the day quietly packing my bag and loading my car with what I could carry. I didn't want to leave anything behind that could be stolen or tampered with. As night fell again, the noises started almost immediately. But this time I was ready. The pot clanged loudly when something bumped the door. I shone my flashlight out and saw a figure move in the dark, just beyond the porch. I grabbed the knife and held my breath. The figure moved slowly away, retreating into the trees. I didn't chase or call out. I stayed inside, heart pounding. By dawn, the noises had stopped. I didn't sleep. I waited until full daylight before I dared step outside. The figure was gone. The footprints were still there, but no new ones. I locked up the cabin one last time and got into my car. As I drove down the ridge road, I looked back. The cabin sat silent among the trees, a small island of wood and stone. But I knew I wasn't alone here. Not really. Later, when I got back to town, I went to the local sheriff's office and reported what happened. They told me the area had problems with trespassers, sometimes hunters or people living rough in the woods. The sheriff warned me not to go back alone. I understood then what had been happening. Someone had been living nearby or passing through the woods, watching the cabin, maybe waiting for me to leave. No ghosts, no monsters, just another person who didn't want to be found, someone with their own reasons for being out there. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me realize how vulnerable you can be when alone in the wilderness. The woods are quiet, but they aren't empty. People are out there, sometimes with no warning, and sometimes they're not friendly. I never went back to the cabin at Pine Ridge. I sold it a few months later, deciding it wasn't worth the risk or the memories. But even now, when I'm in the city, in a crowded room, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That small, cold edge of fear that came from those nights alone in that cabin, surrounded by trees, with footsteps outside and no one around to help. I never thought I'd write about this. I always told myself I'd keep it locked away, buried deep in my mind like something that didn't belong in real life. But I guess sometimes you need to get it out to make sense of it all. This is what happened to me one late fall, in a cabin that felt like it should have been a sanctuary but turned out to be anything but. It started with a simple plan. I wanted to get away from the city. I had been working nonstop for months, and the stress was eating me alive. My job wasn't easy, and I was tired of the noise, the traffic, and the constant buzz of screens. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods, a few hours from where I lived. The place looked perfect in the pictures. A small wooden cabin beside a frozen creek, with thick pine trees all around and a dirt road leading up to it. It wasn't fancy, but that was exactly what I wanted. Simple, quiet, alone. I packed just the basics. Some clothes, food, water, a first aid kit, and my old camping gear. I brought a small lantern, a flashlight, and some batteries. No internet, no cell service. I wanted to disconnect completely. The drive was long but beautiful. The further I got from the city, the quieter everything became. The road narrowed, twisting through the forest. The The trees pressed close to the edges, their branches thick and dark even in the bright afternoon. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills. The cabin was exactly like the pictures. Wooden logs stacked carefully, with a small porch out front and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. The windows were dusty, and the door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like old wood and earth, with a faint scent of smoke from long ago. There was a small kitchen area, a table, a wood stove, and a bed with a thin mattress in the corner. It was cold, but I expected that. The heater didn't work, but I had brought some firewood. After setting my things down, I gathered some dry wood from the nearby pile and started a fire in the stove. It took a while to get going, but once the flames caught, the warmth slowly filled the room. I sat there watching the fire crackle, feeling a strange mix of peace and unease. It was too quiet, too still. Outside, the forest was already swallowing the light. The only sound was the soft rush of the creek nearby and the occasional snap of a twig. I told myself it was nothing, just the normal sounds of the woods. But even then, I felt eyes on me. That first night, I slept poorly. The bed was hard, and I kept waking up to strange sounds. I heard the creek outside, but there were other noises too. Something scraping lightly against the cabin walls, faint enough that I almost convinced myself it was the wind. But the wind didn't sound like scratching. In the morning, I stepped outside to look around. The frost was thick on the ground, crunching under my boots. The creek was almost frozen, the water barely moving beneath a thin layer of ice. I noticed marks on the porch, scratches in the wood, deeper than the night before. I had definitely heard something, but what? The forest was dense, and the dirt road I came on disappeared quickly into the trees. I decided to take a walk, to clear my head. The woods were beautiful in the daylight. The tall pines, the crisp air, the scattered leaves on the forest floor. I tried to relax, to remind myself why I had come here. But then I found something. About 100 yards from the cabin, half hidden under some fallen branches, I saw footprints in the dirt. They were large, too large to be from a person, but not like any animal prints I recognized. The shape was odd, like a mix between a human foot and something else. I stared at them, heart pounding. They led deeper into the woods, but I didn't follow. I took a photo with my phone, though the signal was weak and the image didn't come out well. I went back to the cabin feeling uneasy. I locked the door, even though I was alone out here, miles from the nearest town. That night, I kept the fire burning all night, too afraid to sleep. The next day was worse. I heard heavy footsteps around the cabin, slow, deliberate, sometimes on the roof, sometimes circling the building. I couldn't see anything through the windows, but the sounds were clear. I found more scratches on the door frame and a deep gouge in the wood where something had tried to pry it open. I started to check the windows carefully. One of them had a small crack, like something had hit it hard. I looked outside, but there was nothing except the forest and the creek. The footprints were gone, but I noticed broken branches near the tree line. Something was moving around out there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight and a heavy stick I found in the woods. Every noise outside made me jump. Every shadow looked like it was watching me. On the third day, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, threw my stuff in the car, and got ready to drive back. But as I stepped outside, I stopped cold. The dirt road was blocked. A large fallen tree lay across the path, freshly broken. It wasn't there before. I didn't hear it fall, but the branches were cracked and splintered like something heavy had pushed it down. I tried to move it, but it was too heavy. Panic set in. I was trapped. I went back to the cabin and locked the door again. I felt more vulnerable than ever. The footsteps came back that night, louder, heavier. I could hear something moving through the trees just beyond the clearing, circling, waiting. I kept the fire going and the lantern lit, watching every dark shape. I don't know how many hours passed like that. The fire started to die down, and I was cold, hungry, and exhausted. I thought about my phone, hoping to get a signal somewhere nearby, but it stayed dead. Then I heard it, a deep, guttural growl from the woods. Not an animal I knew. Not a bear. Not a wolf. Nothing I'd ever heard before. It was close. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam caught something moving quickly between the trees. Something big. Too big to be a person. I could see eyes reflecting the light, low to the ground. It wasn't human. I froze. The growl grew louder, a heavy breathing that shook the ground beneath me. I backed inside and slammed the door, holding the stick tight. Morning came and the growling stopped. The footsteps faded. The woods were silent again. I spent the day breaking apart the furniture in the cabin to make barriers, stacking heavy chairs against the door and windows. I felt like a prisoner. Then I noticed something odd. Outside, in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight, were more tracks. Not the same ones from before, but huge, almost the size of my forearm. They circled the cabin slowly, then disappeared into the forest. I realized something terrible. Whatever was out here was watching me. It wasn't just curious, it was hunting. The following night was the worst. The creature came close. I could hear it breathing heavily just outside the cabin. It scratched the walls, snarled, tried to force its way in. I hit the door with my stick, screamed, threw everything I had at the windows. It was relentless. I didn't sleep. I barely moved. By dawn, it had gone, leaving deep gouges in the wood and broken glass on the floor. I knew I couldn't stay. I found a spot on the roof where the creature hadn't destroyed the shingles. Climbing up was dangerous but necessary. I grabbed a rope I had packed and tied it around a big tree nearby. I pulled myself over the edge and onto the roof. From there, I could see the fallen tree blocking the road. With great effort, I climbed down the other side and started clearing branches and logs with my bare hands. It took hours, but eventually, I made a small path enough to squeeze my car through. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked back once. The creature was standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. I never went back. I told myself it was some wild animal, something aggressive and territorial, but I know what I saw. It wasn't normal. It wasn't just an animal. It was something waiting in the woods, something patient, something dangerous. The cabin was supposed to be a place of peace, but for me, it became a trap, a nightmare made real by something lurking just out of sight. That's why I never go camping anymore, because out there, in the silence of the woods, you're not as alone as you think. I hadn't planned on spending the night at the cabin. Honestly, it was supposed to be a quick stop, a place to stretch, have a bite, and then head back home before dark. But as often happens in the woods, things don't go as planned. It started early in the afternoon. I was driving down a narrow, winding road deep in the mountains. The plan was simple: drop off some supplies at an old family cabin that had been empty for years, and then return home. I hadn't been there since I was a kid, and even then, it was just for a few hours during summer vacations. The sun was warm but starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The road was rough, mostly gravel with patches of dirt, and the forest on both sides was dense with towering pines and birches. The air smelled like pine needles, earth, and the faint scent of moss. It was quiet except for the crunch of tires over loose stones and the occasional bird call somewhere high in the trees. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt track. As I pulled in, I noticed how much it had aged. The wood was weathered, the paint peeling and faded, and the roof sagged slightly in one corner. The porch was cluttered with leaves and bits of debris blown in by the wind over the years. Still, it looked solid enough. I climbed out of my truck, stretching my legs and taking a deep breath. The air was cooler here, the kind that makes your skin prick just a little, especially as the sun starts to go down. I grabbed the supplies from the back: some canned goods, tools, a flashlight, and an old propane stove, and headed inside. The cabin smelled musty, like old wood and stale air. Dust covered the floorboards and the furniture, and spiderwebs hung in the corners of the windows. The windows themselves were grimy, letting in just enough light to see by but not enough to make it bright. I opened a window to let some fresh air in, and the sounds of the forest outside filled the room. The the wind rustling the leaves, the distant call of a crow, and the faint hum of insects starting their evening chorus. I set the supplies down on the kitchen table and took a moment to look around. The cabin was small but cozy in a worn-out way. There was a wood stove in the corner, an old sink with a rusty faucet, and a tiny bed shoved into the far corner. The floor creaked underfoot, and the walls were thin, made of rough wooden planks. As the sun dropped lower, I realized I might be cutting it close if I tried to head back right away. The road was tricky, and driving in the dark on gravel is always a bad idea. I decided I'd stay the night. It felt safer, and I could get an early start in the morning. I set up the propane stove to boil some water for coffee and sat down at the table. Outside, the forest was growing darker and the shadows thicker. The temperature dropped quickly. I could feel the chill creeping into the cabin through the gaps in the walls and under the door. I lit the old lantern I had brought, its yellowish glow flickering softly against the walls. The light didn't reach far, but it was enough to keep the darkness at bay for now. After drinking some coffee and eating a small snack, I moved to set up a sleeping area. The bed was narrow and covered in a threadbare blanket. I cleared off the dust and spread out my sleeping bag. It wasn't the most comfortable night's sleep, but it would have to do. By the time I lay down, the sky was completely dark, and the forest outside was alive with sounds. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig from some unseen animal. I tried to relax and let the quiet soothe me. But then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it. A noise outside the cabin. It was subtle at first, a faint scraping like something being dragged across the ground. I froze, straining my ears. The noise stopped, then a low, slow thud on the porch. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling or some animal moving around. The woods were full of critters, and it was normal for them to get curious about the cabin. I closed my eyes again, but then the thud came again. Louder this time. It was definitely on the porch. My heart rate picked up. I got out of bed slowly and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as I moved to the door and looked outside. The porch was empty, nothing but leaves scattered in the wind. I opened the door cautiously and stepped out. The night air was cold and smelled of wet earth. I scanned the area with the flashlight, focusing on the trees and the underbrush nearby. No sign of anything unusual. Then I noticed something on the porch floor. A thin, long scratch running across the wood, fresh and jagged, like a claw had scraped it. The thought made my skin crawl. No animal that size lived around here that I knew of, or at least none that would dare come this close. I shut the door quickly and locked it. The noise had stopped, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to settle back down, but sleep wouldn't come. Every small sound made me jump. The wind rattling the windows, the creak of the cabin settling, the distant howl of some wild animal. Hours passed like that. I kept my flashlight close and the door locked tight. At some point, I heard footsteps, not the light, skittering steps of a squirrel or bird, but heavy, slow steps around the cabin. I didn't dare open the door or look outside. Instead, I sat in the dark, my back against the wall, my breath shallow. The footsteps circled once, then stopped. Silence. Morning was a relief. The sky lightened to a pale blue, and the sun peeked over the trees, warming the cabin and chasing away the cold. I opened the door slowly. The porch was empty except for more scratches, deeper and more jagged now, running along the wood near the steps. I looked around the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was disturbed, as if someone, or something, had walked there in the night. There were footprints, large and heavy, but strangely irregular. Some were muddy, others almost like a drag mark. I packed up quickly and started back down the dirt road. The whole way, I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see something following. When I got back to the main road, I stopped at the ranger station to report what happened. They listened quietly, then told me the area had seen recent break-ins, sometimes by desperate people looking for shelter or supplies. The scratches, the footsteps, the noises, they were signs that someone had been hanging around the cabin, likely hiding out in the woods. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was something more real, Someone dangerous, someone desperate, someone willing to get close and maybe watch for hours to make sure the cabin was empty before moving in. I never went back to that cabin alone. Started as a simple trip, just a weekend getaway. I wanted to get away from the city noise, from the endless emails and phone calls, and from the general rush of life. My friend had found this cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town or paved road. The pictures looked perfect: a small, weathered wooden cabin surrounded by thick trees, a narrow dirt road leading up to it, and a creek running just a few yards away. No electricity, no cell service, no distractions. Just the woods and me. The drive there was long. The last 10 miles or so were on a dirt road so rough and narrow I had to go under 20 miles an hour. Trees pressed close on either side, their branches scraping the car as I passed. The air smelled like pine and wet earth. No other cars, no houses, no people. Just me and the forest. When I arrived, the sun was already low, about 2 hours before dusk. The cabin was small, maybe 15 by 20 feet, built from old logs. It looked sturdy but rough, like it hadn't been touched much in years. There was a porch with a couple of old wooden chairs and a rusty grill. The windows were grimy but intact. I had a key, thankfully, and the door opened with a creak. Inside, it was dark and smelled of dust and wood smoke. The floor was made of old planks, worn but solid. There was a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a single room with a bed pushed against one wall. No electricity, no plumbing, just an outhouse outside. The ceiling was low, and the walls were bare except for some hooks where old coats hung. A fire ring was set up just outside the porch. I unpacked quietly, setting my bag down on the bed, and started to prepare for the night. I had brought a small gas lantern, a lot of firewood, canned food, and a water jug. I lit the stove to warm up the cabin and then headed outside to build a fire. The wood around the cabin was dry and crackled easily. As the fire grew, the orange flames cast long shadows on the trees, and the air smelled like smoke mixed with pine. After dinner, I sat on the porch chair, wrapped in a thick jacket. The forest was dark but alive with sounds. Crickets, frogs near the creek, the occasional rustle of small animals in the bushes. No wind, no storm, just quiet. I went inside around 10 p.m. I was tired from the drive, and the cold night air made me want to sleep. I checked the door locks and windows, double-checked my lantern, and climbed into the bed. The mattress was thin and the blankets rough, but I was too tired to care. At first, sleep came easy, but around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The cabin was completely silent except for the soft crackle of the dying fire in the stove. The moonlight shone faintly through the windows. I felt a chill, but not from the cold. Something felt off. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the newness of the place or maybe a bad dream creeping in. I got up, went to the kitchen to check the stove, and added a bit more wood. The fire sparked back to life, filling the room with warmth. I sat back down on the bed, staring out the window. The woods were black, but I thought I saw something move in the trees. A quick shadow. I blinked, but it was gone. Probably just a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I woke up early to sunlight filtering through the dusty windows. I brewed some coffee on the stove and ate a simple breakfast. I decided to explore the area, take a walk by the creek, maybe hike a bit. The forest was beautiful in the daylight. Tall pines, thick underbrush, moss-covered rocks. I found an old trail, barely visible, leading deeper into the woods. I followed it for a while, enjoying the fresh air and the quiet. No people, no signs of civilization. When I returned, I noticed something strange near the fire ring outside the cabin. There were footprints, big, heavy prints in the dirt, leading toward the creek and then back to the woods. They looked fresh, maybe from the night before. I felt a spike of unease. I was alone out here, miles from anywhere. Who else had been here? And why didn't I hear anything? I examined the footprints carefully. They weren't human. The shape was wider, the toes splayed. They reminded me of something between a bear and a large dog. But the size was strange. too big for any animal I knew in these parts. I took pictures with my phone, though I had no signal to send them. Then I went inside and locked all the doors and windows. That night, the feeling of being watched returned. The woods outside the windows seemed alive, but not with animals. More like something waiting. I tried to sleep again but kept hearing small noises. Branches snapping, twigs breaking, a soft scraping near the walls of the cabin. I stayed awake for hours, clutching a flashlight and my pocket knife. At one point, I thought I heard something heavy moving around the back of the cabin, maybe something pushing against the wall. I didn't dare go outside to check. The fire in the stove went out sometime during the night, and the cold seeped into the room. I huddled under the blankets, eyes wide open, listening to every sound. Morning came slowly, and I was exhausted. During the day, I tried to keep busy. I collected firewood, explored more trails, and kept an eye on the perimeter. I didn't see any more footprints, but the strange feeling never left. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud thud against the cabin wall. It was like something heavy had slammed into the wood. Then another thud, and another, like something trying to break in. My heart pounded. I grabbed my flashlight and pocket knife again. I didn't want to look outside, but the noise was so loud I had to. I peered through a window. Outside, the fire ring was dark. There was nothing there, but the dirt was disturbed, with more giant footprints around the cabin. The prints were close now, almost like whatever had made them was circling the cabin. I wanted to call for help, but no cell service. I sat back down, trying to calm my racing heart. The noise stopped after a while. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed quickly, but as I stepped outside, I saw something that stopped me cold. Near the fire ring was a pile of sticks, arranged carefully. They looked almost like a crude shelter, built by something. Nearby, I found more footprints, heading away from the cabin into the woods. I felt relief and fear at the same time. I started the car, eager to leave. But as I drove down the rough dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. For a long time, I thought I saw movement in the trees, shadows following me. When I finally reached the paved road and the world of cell towers and traffic, I called the local ranger station. I told them about the footprints and the strange noises. They said that area was known for large black bears, especially a few older males that had been unusually aggressive. I realized then what had been stalking me. The prints were bear tracks, just larger and deeper than usual, probably because of the heavy soil and the weight of a big animal. The thuds on the cabin were the bear trying to get at the food I'd left outside. The feeling of being watched was the bear's keen sense, sensing my presence. The shelter of sticks was likely the bear marking territory or a place it had made to rest. There was no monster, no ghost, just a very large and curious, maybe hungry, bear. It was a harsh lesson about respect for the wild and the danger of underestimating nature. I never went back to that cabin. Years ago, I spent a long weekend alone at a small cabin deep in the woods. It wasn't a vacation spot or a rental place meant for tourists. It was an old family cabin, passed down from my grandfather. The kind of place that barely had electricity and certainly no cell phone reception. I had been looking forward to some quiet time to myself. No distractions, no internet, just nature and silence. The cabin itself was built in the 1950s, made of rough logs, with a stone chimney and a tin roof that creaked whenever the wind picked up. It sat about a mile off a gravel road, tucked away in a thick forest of pine and oak trees. The only way in was a narrow dirt path that twisted through the woods, worn down by decades of foot traffic and the occasional four-wheeler. I arrived late Friday afternoon, carrying a heavy pack filled with essentials: food, water, a lantern, firewood, and some tools. The sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled fresh but damp, the ground soft from recent rains. When I finally reached the cabin, I took a moment just to look around. The forest was quiet except for the distant sound of a creek nearby. The cabin looked small and sturdy. Its wooden walls had weathered the years, rough and dark, but still strong. I unlocked the heavy front door with an old rusty key that my dad had given me before I left. Inside, the cabin was simple. An open room with a small kitchen area on the left, a wood-burning stove in the middle, and a sleeping loft above. The floor was covered with pine needles and dust, untouched since the last time someone stayed. I took a deep breath, feeling a mix of excitement and unease. This was going to be different from any city weekend I'd had before. After setting down my pack, I started a fire in the stove. It took some effort to get the kindling lit, but soon enough, the cabin filled with warm orange light and the scent of burning wood. I made some simple food on a camping stove I'd brought. A can of beans, some bread, and ate by the window while watching the forest outside darken into night. The silence was absolute. No cars, no planes, no distant voices. Just the occasional creak of a tree, the rustle of leaves, and the quiet crackle of the fire. I felt peaceful at first, but as the night grew deeper, the silence began to feel heavier. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but there was something about being that alone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I went to bed early, laying out my sleeping bag on the rough wooden floor. The cabin's only window had no glass, just shutters, so a cool breeze blew through the cracks. I pulled my jacket tight and listened to the sounds outside. The wind, an occasional snap of a twig, the distant murmur of the creek. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I couldn't tell what had disturbed me. Then I heard it again, a faint scraping noise, like something dragging across the ground. It was coming from outside, near the side of the cabin. I froze, heart pounding. The cabin was small, and any sound was magnified in the stillness of the night. I grabbed my flashlight from the floor and crept toward the door, careful not to make a sound. I cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The scraping stopped. I waited a moment, then slowly stepped outside. The ground was damp with dew, and the air was cold. I shone the flashlight along the side of the cabin and down the path. Something caught my eye, a long, thin branch lying oddly flat on the ground, as if it had been dragged. I bent down and looked closer. The branch was broken at one end, scraped clean of bark, like it had been used to scratch or scrape against something hard. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be an animal? Maybe a deer or a bear? But the noise had sounded heavier, more deliberate. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I decided to go back inside, lock the door, and check the windows. As I closed the door, I heard the faintest sound of footsteps crunching on leaves, slow, deliberate, and moving away from the cabin. I sat down by the fire, trying to calm myself. My mind kept going over what I'd heard. Maybe it was just some local wildlife, but something about the way the noise moved, pausing, scraping, then walking away, felt too purposeful. The rest of the night was restless. I kept waking up to every small noise, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional owl hoot. At one point, I thought I heard voices whispering outside, but when I shone my flashlight around, there was no one there. It was probably just my imagination. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin, hoping to understand better what might have been lurking nearby. I took my backpack and a sturdy walking stick and headed down the trail. The forest was dense, with tall trees and thick underbrush. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and fallen leaves. As I walked, I kept an eye out for animal tracks or signs of human presence. I came across some deer prints near the creek, but nothing unusual. Then, about half a mile from the cabin, I found something that made my stomach turn. On a tree trunk, scratched deep into the bark, were strange markings. They looked like crude symbols or letters, roughly carved with a sharp object. I examined them closely. They didn't make sense, but they clearly weren't natural. The cuts were fresh, maybe a few days old. I took out my phone to snap a picture. Even though there was no signal here, I figured I'd show it to someone later. The forest suddenly felt colder, darker. I hurried back to the cabin. That afternoon, I tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. I chopped some firewood, tidied up inside the cabin, and even started reading a book I'd brought. But every time I looked out the window, I felt watched. As evening came, I made dinner again and settled by the fire. I kept my flashlight close, just in case. Outside, the wind picked up, shaking branches and making the chimney whistle. Then I heard it again, the scraping noise. Only this time it was closer. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The beam swept across the ground near the fire ring and picnic table just a few yards from the cabin. That's when I saw it. A set of footprints, large and deep, pressed into the soft earth. They were unlike any animal tracks I knew. The shape was broad, with long toes, and the prints were spaced far apart, like something big had been moving quickly. My mind raced with all the stories I'd heard about wild animals in these woods. Bears, mountain lions, but the prints didn't match any of those. They seemed almost human, but bigger. I followed the tracks for a few steps into the trees, but they disappeared in thick underbrush. I debated what to do. I could leave in the morning, but if something large was roaming near the cabin, I wasn't sure I wanted to spend another night there. I decided to stay inside, locking the door and boarding up the window as best I could with some old wooden planks I found stacked in the corner. I kept the fire burning high, knowing that wild animals tend to avoid flames. Night fell quickly. The sounds outside grew louder. The wind, branches snapping, and occasionally a deep grunt or growl that sent chills down my spine. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud banging on the cabin door. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stayed completely still, listening. The banging came again, heavy and slow, like something trying to break in. I grabbed my flashlight and a heavy iron poker from the stove. My hands trembled as I moved toward the door. I wasn't about to open it. Instead, I shined the light outside. The beam caught a dark figure retreating into the trees, moving fast and low. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire stoked, poker ready, every sense alert. When dawn finally broke, I crept outside, half expecting to see damage or footprints. The door was scratched and dented in places. Around the cabin, there were more large footprints, deeper and clearer than before. Something big had been trying to get in. I packed my things quickly and took the trail back to my car. Every few minutes, I glanced back, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching me. When I finally reached the gravel road and heard the sound of my engine, relief washed over me. Driving away, I realized the cabin, the forest, and the strange presence had tested me in ways I'd never expected. It wasn't ghosts or spirits. It was something real and dangerous out there, something primal. I never went back to that cabin alone again. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. Work had been grinding me down, and I needed a break, some fresh air, a quiet place to clear my head. I found a small cabin for rent deep in the woods, a place so remote it had no cell service and no neighbors for miles. The pictures online made it look peaceful, almost cozy, with a little porch overlooking a clearing and a fire pit just outside. The owner said it was perfect for getting away from it all. I arrived late afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. The air smelled clean, cold but crisp for early fall. I parked my car on the gravel driveway, grabbed my bags, and took a deep breath. The woods were quiet except for the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant sound of birds settling in for the night. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, the kind you don't hear every day. The cabin was small. It looked sturdier than I expected, made of thick logs, with a tin roof that gleamed faintly in the fading light. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and was hit with the smell of wood smoke and old pine. The cabin smelled like it had been lived in recently, but not for long. A couple of logs lay stacked beside the small fireplace in the corner. A metal bucket sat near the door for ashes, and there was a simple kitchen area with a tiny stove, a sink, and a few shelves holding old cans and jars. A rickety wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. I set my bags down and walked over to the window. The forest stretched out in every direction, thick and darkening fast. There was a narrow dirt path that wound away from the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I reminded myself to stay on the path tomorrow when I explored. I unpacked slowly, lighting a small kerosene lamp and starting a fire in the fireplace. The fire crackled and gave off a warmth that felt almost like a comfort, but there was something off about the way the shadows danced on the walls. The cabin was cozy, sure, but it was also very isolated. No phone, no internet, no TV, nothing to distract me from the quiet. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and crackers and then sat by the fire, reading a book I had brought along. The night outside grew colder and darker. I could hear the wind whistle softly through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere far away. As the fire died down, I felt the weight of the silence settle in more heavily. My eyes kept flicking to the windows. There was a faint glow of moonlight filtering through the branches, but otherwise, nothing moved. No animals, no people, no cars. I tried to push the feeling aside and went to bed early. The bed was a small mattress on a wooden frame, covered with an old quilt that smelled faintly of mothballs and dust. I pulled the blanket up tight and closed my eyes. It was the middle of the night when I woke up. I wasn't sure why. At first, I thought it was just the cold. Despite the quilt, the cabin seemed to hold the chill of the forest inside. But then I heard it. A faint noise outside, just beyond the window. A rustle, like something brushing against the bushes. I lay still, holding my breath. The noise stopped. I waited, but the silence returned. Maybe it was an animal, deer or raccoon or some kind of small creature moving through the undergrowth. I forced myself to go back to sleep. Then later I heard it again. This time a low scrape, like something dragging against the side of the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The fire was long out, and the only light came from the moon through the small window. I stayed frozen, listening. The scrape stopped after a few seconds, and then all was quiet again. I told myself I was just imagining things. The woods were full of sounds at night, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But I didn't sleep well after that. When the sun finally rose, I climbed out of bed and went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. The grass was wet with dew, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. I looked around carefully, checking for any sign of what might have made the scraping noise. There was a narrow trail worn into the dirt that led around the back of the cabin. I followed it for a few steps but found nothing unusual. No broken branches, no footprints. I checked the side of the cabin where I thought I had heard the noise. The wooden logs were old and weathered but intact.
No scratches, no marks.
I shrugged and told myself to stop worrying. Probably just a branch brushing in the wind. That night, I made sure to keep a small flashlight on the table beside the bed. I was determined to stay alert. Around midnight, the noises started again. First, the rustling, soft, close by. Then the scraping, louder this time. I could hear something moving around the cabin, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and sat up, shining the beam out the window into the dark. At first, I saw nothing but shadows. Then, from the corner of my eye, I caught movement. A figure crouched just beyond the edge of the clearing, near the trees. I blinked. The figure vanished. I swung the flashlight around, searching, but the woods were still. Just trees, leaves, and shadows. My heart pounded. Whoever it was, they were hiding, watching. I tried to convince myself it was a hunter or someone else passing through. But why hide and not come closer? I sat there for what felt like hours, flashlight in hand, listening to the quiet and the occasional snap of twigs. When dawn finally broke, the woods seemed to breathe a little easier. I decided to explore the area more during the daylight hours, hoping to calm my nerves. I packed a small bag with water, a knife, and a map I had printed out before coming. The forest was dense but beautiful. Tall pine and oak trees, thick moss covering the ground, and scattered patches of wildflowers. The trail wound deeper into the woods and then split off in several directions. I followed the main trail for a few miles, keeping an eye out for anything strange. Nothing stood out except for the silence. No birdsong, no squirrels, no insects buzzing. It was odd for the middle of the day. On the way back, I noticed something new near the cabin. A small pile of sticks and leaves, arranged carefully like a makeshift marker. It looked deliberate, but there was no way to know who had put it there. I took a picture with my phone, but of course, there was no signal to send it anywhere. I had the feeling I wasn't alone anymore. The noises had gotten bolder, scraping and rustling right outside the windows, sometimes on the roof. I spent the evening barricading the doors and windows as best as I could, using old furniture and heavy sticks I found lying around. I felt trapped. When the scraping started again after midnight, it was almost constant. Sometimes it sounded like something or someone was trying to pry open the door or move the logs. I stayed awake, gripping the flashlight and the knife. At one point, I swear I saw a shadow move just outside the porch light. I thought about calling the police, but there was no cell signal. No landline either. The nearest house was miles away. I realized then just how isolated I truly was. I spent most of the day preparing to leave. I packed up my things, cleaned the cabin as best as I could, and planned the quickest route back to my car. Before leaving, I walked around the cabin one last time. Near the back, hidden under a pile of leaves, I found fresh footprints in the dirt, too large and heavy for any animal I knew. They led off into the woods and then disappeared. I felt sick. That night, I barely slept. Every sound set my heart racing. Every shadow made me jump. Just before dawn, the scraping started again, but this time it was on the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cold and still. No moon, just the faint light of stars. I shone the flashlight over the roof. Nothing. Then I saw it, a pair of footprints on the roof. Barefoot, huge, with long toes. How had someone climbed up there? I heard a noise behind me and spun around. There was no one. I grabbed my things and didn't stop to look back. I walked quickly down the trail, trying not to make noise. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would give me away. The woods seemed endless. I kept the flashlight off, using only the faint glow of dawn to guide me. After what felt like hours, I reached my car. I locked the doors and sat inside, trembling. I called the owner to tell them I was leaving immediately. On the drive back, I realized how lucky I was. No one had confronted me, but someone had clearly been watching. The police said there had been reports of a local man who lived off the grid, known to lurk around cabins like mine, sometimes stealing or scaring off visitors. I never went back. What I learned from that trip was simple but important. Being alone in the woods can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerous. The things that scare us don't have to be monsters or ghosts. Sometimes, it's just the reality of being vulnerable and exposed to people or situations you can't control. I trusted the cabin would be a safe place, but it wasn't. And I think that's what really unsettled me. The knowledge that out there, in the quiet dark, someone was close enough to watch me, to invade my space, and I had no way to protect myself. No dramatic showdown, no rescue. Just the cold realization that sometimes real danger hides in plain sight. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or anything like that. I never liked scary stories, and I usually avoid going to places where I can imagine something bad happening. But what happened to me in that cabin, well, it wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was something else, something much more real. And that's what made it terrifying. It all started last fall. I had been working nonstop for months, and I needed a break. I wanted to get away from the city noise, from the constant buzz of people and traffic. So, I decided to rent a cabin somewhere deep in the woods, away from everything. I didn't want a fancy hotel or anything, just a quiet place where I could relax, read, and maybe go for some hikes. I found a small cabin online, about a 3-hour drive from my city. The pictures looked perfect. A rustic wooden cabin surrounded by trees, near a small lake. The reviews were good, and the price was right. So I booked it for a long weekend. The drive there was peaceful. I left early in the morning and took back roads most of the way. The leaves were just starting to change color, and the air was crisp. I remember the sky was clear and bright blue. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly like in the photos. It was small, maybe 2 rooms, one main room with a fireplace and a kitchen area, and a separate bedroom. There was a porch with a couple of chairs facing the woods. I parked my car in the little gravel driveway and stepped out. The quiet hit me like a wave. No cars, no voices, just the sounds of the forest. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. and the faint splash of water from the lake nearby. I felt good, like I'd finally escaped. Inside the cabin, the air was cool but fresh. The wood smelled a little musty but not bad. There were a few basic supplies left by the owner. Some firewood stacked neatly by the fireplace, a few cans of food, and a bottle of water. The place wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. I unpacked my stuff quickly and went out on the porch with a cup of coffee. The lake was just a short walk away, and I could see it through the trees, calm and still. The first night was quiet and uneventful. I made a fire in the fireplace, cooked some canned soup, and read a book until I got tired. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I slept well in the old bed, wrapped in thick blankets. The next day, I planned to hike a trail that started just behind the cabin. It was supposed to be about 5 miles, looping through the forest and ending near a small waterfall. I packed a backpack with water, snacks, a flashlight, and my phone, just in case. The trail was beautiful. The trees were tall and colorful, and the ground was covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves. I didn't see anyone else on the trail, which was exactly what I wanted. As I walked, I noticed signs warning about bears in the area. I wasn't too worried. I made some noise occasionally by clapping or talking out loud, just to make sure I didn't surprise any animals. About 2 miles in, I reached a clearing that looked out over a valley. The sun was shining through the branches, casting warm light on the hills below. I sat on a rock for a while, eating a sandwich and taking in the view. After that, I kept walking toward the waterfall. The trail got narrower and rougher, but it was still easy enough. When I finally reached the waterfall, it was smaller than I expected, but still pretty. The water tumbled over some rocks into a shallow pool. I took a few photos and rested for about 20 minutes, listening to the sound of the water. That's when I noticed something strange. On the other side of the pool, partially hidden behind some bushes, I saw what looked like a small campsite. There was a fire pit with ashes, a few scattered pieces of trash, and a makeshift lean-to shelter made from branches and a tarp. I didn't want to get too close, but I also felt curious. Who else was out here? The campsite looked old but not abandoned for long, maybe a few days. I took a quick look around and didn't see any signs of people nearby. I decided to head back before it got dark. The sun was starting to lower in the sky, and I wanted to be back at the cabin before nightfall. The hike back was uneventful, but I kept thinking about that campsite. It was odd. The cabin rental information didn't mention anyone else allowed on the property. The nearest neighbors were supposed to be miles away. When I got back to the cabin, I decided to call the rental company just to double-check if anyone else was supposed to be around. The woman on the phone said no. The cabin was private, and they didn't allow other campers on the land. She suggested I let them know if I saw any signs of trespassers. That made me uneasy, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Maybe it was just some hikers passing through or someone who had set up camp illegally. That night, I was in bed by 10 p.m. I had just started to drift off when I heard a noise outside the cabin. It was faint, like a twig snapping or a branch rubbing against the cabin wall. I froze and listened closely. The forest was otherwise still. I got up quietly and peered out the window. The porch light was off, so the area was dark except for the faint glow of the moon. I couldn't see anything moving, but the feeling of being watched crept over me. I went back to bed, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal. I tried to ignore it and fell asleep again. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was shining, and the air smelled fresh. I went outside to start a fire for breakfast. As I gathered some wood, I noticed footprints in the dirt near the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints. The prints were fresh, maybe from the night before. That made my stomach tighten. Someone had been near my cabin while I was sleeping. I checked all the doors and windows to make sure they were locked. Everything was secure, but the thought that someone had been outside during the night made me uneasy. I spent the day trying to shake off the feeling. I went for another short walk, stayed close to the cabin, and kept the fire going all day. I didn't want to be outside alone after dark. That evening, I was cooking dinner on the small stove inside when I heard another noise. This time it was louder, like something scraping against the side of the cabin. I grabbed my phone and flashlight and slowly walked outside. The night was darker now, with clouds covering the moon. I swept the flashlight beam around the yard. There were no animals, no movement. But then I saw something on the ground near the back door. A large, rusty knife lying in the dirt. My heart pounded hard. I didn't understand how a knife got there or who left it. I picked it up carefully and brought it inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, knife in hand, waiting for morning. The next day, I called the rental company again. This time, I told them about the footprints and the knife. They said they would send someone to check the cabin first thing the next day and advised me to leave if I felt unsafe. I wanted to stay. I thought maybe it was just some kids playing a prank or hunters passing through. But the feeling of being watched and the knife changed everything. That night, I slept with the lights on and the doors locked tight. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Heavy, slow steps walking around the cabin. I could hear them circling, stopping for a moment, then moving again. I stayed completely still, heart racing. I didn't dare look out the window. The footsteps kept going for nearly 10 minutes before fading away into the woods. When morning came, I packed my things as fast as I could. I wasn't going to wait for the rental company's inspection. I just wanted to get out. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. A few weeks later, I called the rental company one last time. They told me they found evidence of someone else staying on the property illegally. Old campsites, fire pits, and even some trash. They said they called the local authorities to investigate, but since no one was caught in the act, it was hard to do much. I never went back, and I never rented a cabin alone again. I'm not the type to scare easily. I've spent plenty of time outdoors, camping, hiking, fishing, and I'm comfortable with silence, darkness, and the sounds of the forest. But one trip to a small, old cabin in the woods taught me that even the most experienced can find themselves caught off guard. This is the story of that night. It started in early October, when the air was crisp but not yet freezing. I wanted to get away from the city and the noise, so I booked a small cabin called Pine Ridge Cabin, about 2 hours drive from where I live. The cabin was a rental through a local outfitter, located deep in a dense forest with nothing but trees for miles. No cell service, no neighbors close enough to hear you shout. The place was small, maybe 16 by 20 feet, with one room that had a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a narrow loft for sleeping. The windows were old and single-paned, with cracks here and there, but the cabin looked solid. It had running water through a well pump and a small propane fridge. No electricity, no internet, no phone signal. Exactly what I wanted. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road to the cabin was a narrow dirt track, winding through thick pines and hardwoods. It was quiet except for the crunch of my tires on gravel and the occasional bird call. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, fresh and clean. I parked the car near a small clearing where the cabin sat on a slight rise overlooking a narrow creek that ran down a hill not far away. I unpacked my gear slowly, taking my time. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. The wood stove looked like it hadn't been used much in recent months but seemed functional. The loft had a mattress with a thick wool blanket folded on top. I stacked my backpack and sleeping bag in the corner and set up my small camping stove for cooking. As the sun lowered, I gathered firewood from the nearby forest, dead branches dry enough for a fire. I built a small stack by the wood stove, then went outside to collect more kindling from the ground, careful to avoid stepping on dry leaves that might catch fire unintentionally. When night fell, I closed the windows and lit the wood stove. The small cabin filled with warmth quickly, and I started cooking dinner. Canned chili warmed on the camping stove since the propane fridge was mostly empty except for a few bottles of water and juice. After eating, I cleaned up, stacked the dishes neatly, and settled near the stove with a book. The cabin was cozy, the wood stove crackling softly. Outside, the wind whispered through the branches, making the trees sway gently. That's when I noticed it. A sudden snap of a branch, loud and sharp, outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. but the sound repeated, a slow, deliberate stepping on branches, closer each time. The footsteps were heavy, not the quick scampering of small animals. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. I froze. The warmth of the cabin seemed to vanish. My heartbeat sped up as I listened closely. The footsteps stayed still for a long moment, then faded away into the woods. I told myself it was probably a hunter or a camper walking nearby, maybe a deer moving slowly on thick branches. But still, the feeling lingered. The forest didn't usually have humans walking this late. I hadn't heard a car for hours. There was no trail leading directly to the cabin except the dirt road I came in on. I double-checked the windows and the door locks. Everything was secure. I pulled the curtains closed and sat back down by the stove, trying to calm myself. Hours passed. The wind grew stronger, rattling the loose window panes. The fire flickered, shadows dancing along the wooden walls. I kept looking toward the window, half expecting to see something out there. Then I heard it. A faint scraping noise, like metal against wood, soft but persistent, came from the back of the cabin. I got up slowly, grabbed the flashlight from the table, and crept toward the door leading to the small porch in the back. I shone the light outside. The beam caught the rough outline of a tree trunk and the scattered leaves on the ground. Nothing else. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face. The forest was dark and thick, the trees like black pillars. I scanned the area carefully but saw no movement. The scraping noise had stopped. I walked around the back of the cabin, flashlight in hand, looking for anything unusual. That's when I noticed the lock on the back door had been tampered with. The hasp was slightly bent, scratched. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here trying to get inside. I hurried back inside, locked both doors again, and checked all windows. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the kitchen shelf and sat back by the stove, trying to stay calm but alert. I spent the rest of the night wide awake. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept my eyes on the door, ready to defend myself if needed. At first light, I decided I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed my gear quickly, making as little noise as possible, then started the car and drove away, glancing back once at the quiet cabin. Weeks later, I called the outfitter to report the broken lock. They told me no one else had rented the cabin in the past month and that the area was considered safe. Still, the feeling of being watched that night stayed with me. That's the short version, but I'll walk you through every detail to really paint the picture of what I experienced so you can feel what I felt. I drove out on a Thursday afternoon, leaving behind the noise of city life and the stress of work. The highway gave way to back roads, and then a gravel path that narrowed into a single lane, barely wide enough for my old SUV. The forest closed in on both sides as I climbed higher, the trees tall and thick, their branches intertwining overhead like a natural ceiling. I stopped once to stretch my legs by a small creek running alongside the road. The water was clear and cold, and I cupped a handful to drink. The air was clean, and I felt the tension from the week slipping away. Pine Ridge Cabin sat on a small clearing. It looked even smaller up close, surrounded by towering trees and fallen leaves that formed a soft carpet on the ground. The cabin was made of rough-hewn logs, the roof covered with faded green metal sheets. A small chimney poked out, and a wooden porch ran across the front, with a broken rocking chair leaning against a post. The windows were dirty and clouded but intact. The front door was wooden and heavy, with a rusted iron handle. I pulled it open, and a rush of stale, cold air greeted me. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, with smoke, and something faintly like damp clothes left to dry too long. The floor creaked underfoot, and the single room was sparsely furnished. A wooden table sat near the window, 2 folding chairs leaned against the wall, and the loft was accessed by a narrow ladder. I dropped my bags and lit a small lantern. The flickering light brought warmth to the shadows. Starting a fire in the wood stove was not easy. The previous tenant had left behind a small pile of ashes and some half-burnt logs that were damp. I scraped out the ashes, laid down some newspaper, and stacked small sticks and pine cones. Striking matches with cold fingers, I got the fire going slowly. The smell of burning paper and dry wood filled the cabin. Soon, Flames licked the inside of the stove, and warmth began to spread. I sat near the stove, sipping water and unpacking my food. The fire crackled, and the shadows danced. Outside, the daylight dimmed fast. After dinner, the cabin was dark except for the firelight and my lantern. I sat reading a paperback I brought, the silence broken only by the crackle of the stove and the occasional gust of wind outside. Suddenly, a snap outside startled me. It was louder than a twig breaking, something heavy stepping on wood or branches. I froze, straining to listen. The sound repeated, slow, measured. It circled the cabin once and then stopped. The hairs on my arms stood up. I thought maybe it was a hunter or an animal, but the footsteps felt deliberate. There was no trail behind the cabin, only thick brush and trees. I looked out the window, but the forest was a dark wall of shadows. My mind raced. Maybe someone was trying to break in. I checked the door locks. Everything was secure, but the thought of being watched kept gnawing at me. I tried to settle down but was constantly alert. Then, the scraping sound at the back of the cabin made me freeze. I grabbed the flashlight and went outside. The night air was cold and smelled of wet earth. The beam of light caught the old wood of the cabin and the leaf-strewn ground. No one was there, but when I inspected the back door, the hasp was bent and scratched. Someone had tried to open it. I stayed awake the entire night, the skillet in hand, fire burning low. Every sound made me jump. Branches cracking, leaves rustling, animals calling. The forest felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. It was like the darkness was watching me back. When dawn finally broke, I packed up without making a sound. I didn't stay to find out who was there or why. I drove away, heart pounding. I reported the damage. No one else had been. It started as a simple trip. I needed to get away. Work had been draining me for months. Every day felt like a repeat. The same long hours, the same meaningless meetings, the same noise in my head. I just wanted quiet, some fresh air, and a break from people. The city was crushing me. So, I rented a small cabin in a remote area called Pine Ridge. It wasn't far from the city, about a 3-hour drive, but far enough to feel like I was leaving everything behind. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a one-room wooden building with a small porch, a wood stove for heat, and a tiny kitchen area. No electricity, no internet, no cell service. Exactly what I wanted. The place was surrounded by dense forest. Tall pine trees everywhere, their trunks straight and thick. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there was a small creek not far from the cabin. The air smelled like fresh wood and earth, cool and clean. I arrived late afternoon and unloaded my stuff quickly. I brought food, water, a good supply of firewood, a flashlight, and a heavy-duty camping knife I kept for emergencies. The first night was quiet, almost peaceful. I made a fire in the stove, cooked some canned beans, and sat on the porch watching the sunset. The sky turned from orange to purple and finally black. The stars came out in full force, so many that I forgot how small I was compared to the universe. No sounds except the wind rustling through the trees and the distant trickle of the creek. I felt like I was somewhere untouched by people, and for a moment, I breathed deeply and let go of all the stress. But that night, I had trouble sleeping. Not because of ghosts or anything supernatural, just because I wasn't used to the silence and the dark. The cabin's old wooden floor creaked now and then. Outside, I heard the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves. My brain kept telling me those sounds were dangerous, but logically I knew they weren't. When I finally fell asleep, it was a restless, light sleep. I woke up several times hearing noises outside, maybe a deer or some animal moving nearby. I told myself it was normal. The next day, I spent hours walking through the woods. I took a small trail that led to a clearing with a view over the valley below. It was beautiful, but the more I explored, the more I noticed how quiet everything really was. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, just silence and the wind. That felt off, but I brushed it aside. That evening, I made a bigger fire in the cabin stove and settled in early. I pulled out a book, but I couldn't focus. The silence was heavy. I was too alert, too aware of every sound. Then I heard something else, faint but distinct. Footsteps, crunching in the dry leaves just outside the cabin. I froze. The sound stopped when I stopped moving. Then it started again a few steps away, slow and deliberate. Someone was walking around the cabin. Not running, not panicking, just walking and listening, it seemed. I grabbed my flashlight and the knife. My heart pounded, but I didn't want to run or hide. I wanted to know what was happening. I moved to the door and looked outside. The moon was bright, casting shadows through the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but the footprints in the dirt were clear. Heavy boots, deep impressions. Someone big and heavy had walked around the cabin. I called out softly, "Hello!" No answer. The footsteps stopped. The night was silent again. I locked the door and backed away, but my mind raced. Who was out here? The cabin was supposed to be isolated. No neighbors for miles. No roads nearby. Was someone lost? Or was it something else? I didn't sleep well that night. Every crack of wood, every whisper of wind made me jump. I kept my knife close. The next morning, I decided to hike back to my car. Something didn't feel right. I packed up quickly, grabbed my gear, and headed out on the trail. But as I walked, I noticed something strange. The trail I had taken the day before looked disturbed. Branches snapped, footprints everywhere, some of them not human. Long, dragging marks in the dirt, deep gouges. The trees around the trail had scratch marks on their bark, as if someone or something had clawed them. I felt my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it and kept walking. The trail twisted and turned, but after a while, it just stopped. There was no path forward, just thick forest, dark and tangled. I stopped and looked around, realizing I must have taken a wrong turn. I pulled out my phone to check GPS, no signal. No way to call for help. My heart sank. I was lost. I tried retracing my steps, but the trail was gone. The woods all looked the same, tall pines and dense underbrush. The sun was starting to drop lower, and shadows grew long and strange. I started walking aimlessly, hoping to find the creek or some sign of the cabin. But the forest seemed to close in on me. The trees blocked the sky, and the wind died down. The silence was so complete it felt like I was underwater. After what felt like hours, I spotted smoke in the distance. Relief flooded me. Someone was nearby, maybe another camper or a ranger station. I hurried toward it, but the smoke stopped suddenly. The air smelled like burning leaves and wood, but I couldn't find the source. No fire, no camp. I kept walking and finally reached a small clearing. In the center was an old, abandoned hunting cabin. The wood was rotting, the windows broken. Inside, I could see old cans and rusted tools. This wasn't the place I rented, but it was shelter. I decided to stay there overnight. I made a small fire outside with dry sticks and sat near it, watching the forest. The night was cold and dark. I kept hearing sounds, whispers in the wind, distant branches snapping, soft footfalls that stopped whenever I looked. I stayed awake most of the night, knife ready. The next morning, I found deep footprints around the cabin. They looked fresh, heavy, wide, and uneven. Not human, I was sure of that. I started to panic. Something was out here watching me. Whatever it was, it had to be big and strong. I knew I couldn't stay in the forest much longer. I had to get out. I spent the day moving slowly toward where I thought the road was. I marked trees with my knife, tried to keep track of direction. Every so often, I would stop and listen, afraid of what might be following me. As the sun set, I saw headlights in the distance. A car. I waved frantically, shouting. The car slowed and stopped. A man got out and came toward me. I was so relieved I almost collapsed. He introduced himself as a local hunter who was out checking traps. He had seen the smoke and came looking. I told him I was lost and needed a ride back. He nodded, and as we walked back, I told him about the footprints and the noises. He listened carefully and then said, "You probably saw a bear or maybe a mountain lion. They're not friendly, and they can make a mess of things." I didn't sleep that night until I was safely back in the city. Looking back, I know I was lucky. The forest is wild, and sometimes wild things don't want humans around. The cabin was just a place in the middle of nowhere, but the real danger was being unprepared and underestimating how easily nature can turn hostile. Now, whenever I think about Pine Ridge, I remember the silence that wasn't peaceful, the shadows that hid more than trees, and the heavy footprints that made me realize how small and vulnerable I really am out there.